Long before the Second Wizarding War erupted into open conflict, another figure quietly guided the Ministry of Magic through a fragile era of peace. Cornelius Fudge was not a legendary duelist, nor a revolutionary reformer. He was a careful administrator who believed that stability, reputation, and public confidence were the most important tools a minister could possess. For many years, that approach seemed to work. The wizarding world appeared calm, orderly, and far removed from the darkness that had defined Voldemort's rise. But history often reveals how leadership is tested not during quiet years, but in moments when uncomfortable truths begin to surface and denial becomes far more dangerous than fear. Long before Cornelius Fudge ever walked through the doors of the minister's office, the wizarding government he would one day lead had already existed for centuries. The Ministry of Magic was not simply a building filled with offices and departments. It was the center of authority for the entire British wizarding community, responsible for maintaining secrecy, enforcing magical law, and managing relations between wizards and the non-magical world. Over time, the ministry had developed into a complex structure of departments and committees, each responsible for a different part of magical society. By the time Fudge eventually rose within its ranks, the institution itself had already shaped the expectations of what a minister should be. The British Ministry of Magic had been formally established in the early 18th century, shortly after the International Statute of Secrecy was enacted. That law required wizarding communities around the world to conceal magic from muggles. In Britain, this responsibility fell to the ministry. From that moment onward, the wizarding government became the guardian of secrecy. If magical creatures were spotted by muggles, the ministry responded. If spells caused damage in the non-magical world, ministry officials quietly repaired the problem and altered memories where necessary. This responsibility required an enormous bureaucratic system, and over time, the ministry grew into one of the most powerful institutions in the wizarding world. At the top of this structure stood the Minister for Magic. Although the position carried great authority, it was not the same as an absolute ruler. The minister worked alongside other governing bodies, most notably the Wizengamot. The Wizengamot functioned both as a high court and a legislative body, composed of senior witches and wizards who helped interpret magical law. In theory, the minister represented the executive authority of the wizarding government, while the Wizengamot ensured that laws were enforced and interpreted properly. In practice, the relationship between these institutions often depended on the personalities involved. Beneath the minister were numerous departments, each responsible for a different part of wizarding life. One of the most influential was the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. This department oversaw the Aurora Office, which pursued dark wizards and criminals, as well as the Improper Use of Magic Office and the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office. The Auras in particular became famous during times of conflict, especially during the years when Voldemort and his followers threatened the wizarding world. Another important division was the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. This department managed relations between humans and magical beings such as goblins, centaurs, and house elves. It was also responsible for classifying magical creatures and ensuring they remained within safe boundaries of wizarding law. While this work rarely attracted public attention, it often involved delicate negotiations with groups who did not always trust wizarding authorities. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes handled a very different type of crisis. Whenever magic went wrong in a way that threatened exposure to muggles, this department stepped in. Obliviators modified memories, magical repair teams restored damaged buildings, and officials quietly erased evidence of magic from the non-magical world. In many ways, this department served as the quiet backbone of the entire secrecy system. There was also the Department of International Magical Cooperation, which maintained diplomatic relations with other wizarding governments. Wizarding communities around the world were connected through shared laws, trade agreements, and magical treaties. The British ministry could not operate in isolation, and maintaining these relationships was a constant responsibility. Deep within the Ministry building itself existed one of the most mysterious divisions of all, the Department of Mysteries. Unlike the other departments, very little was known about its work. The unspeakables who worked there studied forces such as time, prophecy, love, and death. Even senior Ministry officials rarely spoke about what happened inside those chambers. Yet the existence of the Department of Mysteries reminded everyone that the wizarding government was not only concerned with politics and law, it was also responsible for understanding the deeper forces that shaped magical reality itself. The Ministry building reflected this enormous structure. Hidden beneath London, the Ministry was a sprawling underground complex of corridors, offices, and meeting chambers. Employees traveled between levels using magical lifts that stopped at each department. The atrium served as the public entrance, where visitors arrived through the Flu network or other magical methods. For many witches and wizards, the Ministry represented both security and authority. It was where laws were enforced, where disputes were settled, and where the future of wizarding society was quietly managed behind closed doors. But despite this impressive structure, the Ministry was not immune to the pressures of history. Political leadership often shaped how the institution responded to crisis. Some ministers ruled with decisive authority, especially during times of danger. Others governed more cautiously, focusing on stability and public reassurance. The success of a minister often depended not only on their personal ability, but also on the challenges of their era. One of the most important periods in the Ministry's history occurred during the rise of Tom Riddle, who would later become known as Lord Voldemort. During those years, the wizarding government faced a threat unlike any it had encountered before. Voldemort gathered followers known as Death Eaters and began a campaign of terror across the wizarding world. The Ministry struggled to contain the violence. Auras hunted dark wizards, trials filled the Wizengamot chambers, and fear spread through magical communities. Eventually, Voldemort's first reign of terror came to an abrupt end when his attack on the Potter family failed. The wizarding world believed him destroyed. The Ministry, exhausted by years of conflict, suddenly found itself responsible for rebuilding trust and restoring normal life. Many Death Eaters were captured and imprisoned in Azkaban, though some escaped punishment by claiming they had been controlled through the Imperious Curse. For the first time in years, the wizarding community felt something close to peace. Shops reopened fully, public celebrations returned, and families who had lived in fear began rebuilding their lives. Yet beneath this relief remained a lingering sense of uncertainty. Voldemort's disappearance was mysterious. Few people understood exactly what had happened that night in Godric's Hollow. During this fragile period of recovery, the Ministry of Magic became more important than ever. Wizards looked to their government for reassurance that the war had truly ended. The institution needed leaders who could maintain stability, calm public fear, and ensure that the horrors of the past would not return. It was into this environment that a quiet Ministry official named Cornelius Fudge would eventually rise. At the time, few people would have predicted that he would one day become Minister for Magic. He was not famous for heroic battles or brilliant magical discoveries. Instead, he was known for something far less dramatic, but often more valuable in government: reliability. The Ministry he would inherit was an institution built on centuries of tradition, layered with departments, committees, and political expectations. It had survived wars, rebellions, and international disputes. Yet, like any government, it depended on the decisions of the people who led it. And, in the years ahead, the choices made by Cornelius Fudge would test whether the Ministry's structure was strong enough to withstand a threat that had once nearly destroyed the wizarding world. The night Voldemort disappeared marked the end of the darkest chapter the wizarding world had faced in generations. News spread quickly through magical communities across Britain. For years, witches and wizards had lived under the shadow of violence, uncertainty, and fear. Families whispered about disappearances. Friends quietly wondered who could be trusted. When Voldemort's power suddenly collapsed, relief swept through the wizarding population like a powerful wind clearing away a storm. Yet relief did not immediately bring certainty. The wizarding world had witnessed too much chaos during the war to believe that peace would arrive overnight. Voldemort had not simply been a criminal or a rebel. He had been the leader of a movement built on fear, secrecy, and loyalty enforced through dark magic. Even with his disappearance, many of his followers still remained. The Ministry of Magic suddenly found itself responsible for restoring order in a society that had been shaken for years. During the conflict, Aurors had been given extraordinary authority to capture dark wizards. Many dangerous individuals had been arrested and sent to Azkaban, the fortress prison located on a remote island in the North Sea. The prison was guarded by Dementors, creatures that fed on human despair. Under their watch, Azkaban became a place from which almost no prisoner ever escaped. After Voldemort's fall, trials filled the chambers of the Wizengamot. Witches and wizards, accused of serving the Dark Lord, were brought forward to answer for their actions. Some openly admitted their loyalty to Voldemort. Others claimed they had been forced into service or placed under the Imperious Curse. Determining the truth was not always easy. Many crimes had taken place in secret, and witnesses were often reluctant to speak. Some of the most well-known Death Eaters were captured and sentenced to life imprisonment. Bellatrix Lestrange, along with her husband Rodolphus and his brother Rabastan, was convicted for the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom, two Aurors who had fought bravely during the war. Their crimes shocked even those who had already witnessed the brutality of Voldemort's followers. The Longbottoms were left permanently damaged by the torture they endured, and the Lestranges were sent to Azkaban for life. Others, however, managed to avoid punishment entirely. Several former Death Eaters claimed they had acted only because they were under the Imperious Curse. This defense created controversy throughout the wizarding world. Some believed these claims were genuine, while others suspected that powerful families were using influence and wealth to escape justice. The Ministry, eager to move forward and restore stability, sometimes accepted these explanations. Lucius Malfoy became one of the most prominent examples. A wealthy and influential wizard, Malfoy insisted that he had been forced to serve Voldemort through magical coercion. The Ministry accepted his explanation, allowing him to return to society without facing imprisonment. Decisions like this created quiet resentment among those who believed that many of Voldemort's supporters had avoided true accountability. Despite these tensions, the overall mood of the wizarding world gradually shifted toward hope. For the first time in years, people began to believe that life might return to normal. Children returned to Hogwarts without the constant fear that their parents might vanish overnight. Magical businesses reopened fully, and public gatherings once again became common. Hagrid's flight across the country on Sirius Black's flying motorcycle had delivered the orphaned Harry Potter safely to the home of his relatives. The boy who had survived Voldemort's attack quickly became a symbol of the war's end. Many witches and wizards viewed Harry as the child who had defeated the most feared dark wizard in history. His name was spoken with wonder, though very few people understood the truth of what had happened that night. At the Ministry of Magic, leaders faced a delicate challenge. They needed to reassure the public that the danger had passed, while also maintaining vigilance against any remaining threats. Official statements emphasized the defeat of Voldemort and the success of the Auror Office. The Ministry presented itself as the institution that had ultimately restored order. At the time, the Minister for Magic was Millicent Bagnold. Her leadership during the war had been marked by strong defense of wizarding independence, particularly in relation to the International Statute of Secrecy. During Voldemort's reign, there had been moments when magical events threatened to spill into the Muggle world. Bagnold firmly insisted that the wizarding government would manage its own affairs without outside interference. Her famous declaration after the war captured the spirit of the moment. She reportedly stated that people had the right to celebrate their victory, even if those celebrations briefly risked exposure to Muggles. In the wizarding world, the night Voldemort fell was remembered as a time when joy overwhelmed caution. Still, the Ministry understood that celebration alone would not erase the scars of war. The Aura Office continued tracking down remaining supporters of Voldemort. Some Death Eaters had fled into hiding rather than face trial. Others attempted to quietly re-enter society, hoping their past loyalties would remain undiscovered. Families who had resisted Voldemort's rule carried their own burdens. The Order of the Phoenix, the secret organization led by Albus Dumbledore, had lost many members during the conflict. Brave witches and wizards, such as Marlene McKinnon, Edgar Bones, and Dorcas Meadows, had been killed during the fighting. Their sacrifices were remembered quietly within the community. Even among ordinary citizens, trust had been damaged. During the war, Voldemort's followers often operated through intimidation and secrecy. Some neighbors had betrayed one another. Some families had been divided by loyalty to different sides. Rebuilding that sense of trust would take time. In the years following Voldemort's fall, the Ministry attempted to present an image of stability and confidence. Public officials emphasized that the wizarding world had survived its greatest challenge. Schools remained open, businesses flourished again, and magical society continued its routines. On the surface, it appeared that peace had truly returned. Yet, beneath that calm surface, lingered questions that few people wanted to confront. Voldemort's body had never been recovered. No official explanation existed for how his power had vanished so suddenly. Some whispered that dark magic of such magnitude could not simply disappear. Most witches and wizards preferred not to dwell on these uncertainties. The memory of the war was painful enough without speculating about its possible return. As the years passed, younger generations grew up hearing the story of Voldemort as something that belonged firmly in the past. For the Ministry of Magic, this collective desire for peace shaped political priorities. Leaders understood that the wizarding public wanted reassurance above all else. The government focused on maintaining normal life rather than preparing for another conflict. In this environment, certain qualities became especially valuable within the ministry's ranks. Officials who appeared calm, dependable, and practical gained the trust of their colleagues. Dramatic personalities were less desirable in a government that wanted to project stability. It was during this period that Cornelius Fudge quietly built his career inside the ministry. He was not yet a prominent figure in wizarding politics, but the world he was entering had been deeply shaped by the aftermath of Voldemort's defeat. The wizarding community longed for normalcy, and the ministry aimed to provide it. Stability, reassurance, and careful administration became the guiding principles of the government. For a time, those principles seemed exactly what the wizarding world needed. But history would eventually reveal that the peace following Voldemort's first defeat was more fragile than anyone realized. In the years after the First Wizarding War, the Ministry of Magic entered a period that appeared calm on the surface. Offices that had once been filled with urgent reports and emergency meetings slowly returned to routine work. Auras still carried out investigations, and the Wizengamot still heard legal cases, but the sense of immediate danger had faded. It was during this quieter era that many ministry officials continued their careers with little attention from the wider wizarding world. Among them was a man named Cornelius Oswald Fudge. Very little about Fudge's early life is widely discussed in wizarding history. Unlike famous auras or legendary Hogwarts professors, he did not begin his career surrounded by dramatic events. Instead, he entered government service through the ordinary paths that many witches and wizards followed after leaving school. Those who later worked with him often described him as organized, dependable, and careful in the way he approached his duties. The ministry was a vast institution that relied heavily on bureaucracy. Many of its responsibilities required patience rather than boldness. Records had to be maintained, incidents documented, and regulations enforced quietly without drawing unnecessary attention. Officials who performed this work well rarely became famous, but they were essential to the ministry's daily operation. Fudge found his place within this system through work connected to the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. This department dealt with situations where magic had gone wrong, or where magical activity risked exposure to muggles. Incidents could range from misfired spells that damaged buildings to magical creatures accidentally appearing in non-magical areas. When such problems occurred, ministry teams responded quickly to repair the situation and ensure that secrecy was preserved. Work in this department required calm decision-making. Officials needed to coordinate memory modifications, repair magical damage, and sometimes negotiate with confused or frightened muggles who had witnessed something unusual. These responsibilities demanded attention to detail and an understanding of how quickly small problems could become larger crises. Fudge developed a reputation as someone who could manage these situations effectively. He was not known for dramatic solutions, but rather for his ability to follow procedure and keep events under control. Colleagues noted that he preferred practical responses instead of risky improvisation. In an environment where mistakes could expose the wizarding world, such caution was often valued. The ministry also relied heavily on communication between departments. Magical accidents might involve creatures regulated by another office, or legal questions that required consultation with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Officials who could navigate this complicated system and maintain cooperation between departments became increasingly valuable. Fudge demonstrated skill in working within these structures. He understood the importance of keeping senior officials informed while ensuring that smaller problems were resolved quickly. Over time, this approach helped him gain trust among those who supervised ministry operations. Another factor that helped his career was his personality. Many who later spoke about Fudge described him as friendly and approachable. He enjoyed conversation and was often eager to share information about ministry activities. While some officials preferred to remain distant or reserved, Fudge seemed comfortable interacting with colleagues across multiple departments. This willingness to engage with others made him a recognizable presence within the ministry. In a large institution where hundreds of witches and wizards worked across numerous offices, being known personally could help someone build connections that proved useful later. Fudge's professional reputation grew gradually rather than dramatically. There was no single event that suddenly elevated him to prominence. Instead, he advanced through steady work and consistent performance. Senior officials began to see him as a reliable administrator who could be trusted with increasing responsibility. At the same time, the wizarding world continued adjusting to life after the war. The ministry focused on reinforcing public confidence and maintaining the sense that the dangers of the past had truly ended. Officials who supported this atmosphere of stability often gained political advantage. Fudge's temperament fit naturally into this environment. He was not interested in dramatic reforms or controversial policies. Instead, he believed that the ministry's role was to preserve order and reassure the public that everything was under control. For many citizens still recovering from years of fear, that message was comforting. During these years, Fudge also began interacting more frequently with higher levels of ministry leadership. His work occasionally brought him into contact with senior administrators and department heads who oversaw major government operations. These interactions allowed him to observe how decisions were made at the highest levels of wizarding politics. Although he had not yet entered the central arena of political leadership, Fudge paid close attention to how the ministry managed public perception. Government officials often balanced practical decisions with the need to maintain confidence among the wizarding population. Rumors, public opinion, and media coverage all played roles in shaping how ministry actions were received. One of the most influential forces in shaping that public perception was the Daily Prophet. As the primary wizarding newspaper in Britain, the Prophet served as the main source of information for witches and wizards across the country. Ministry officials frequently worked with the newspaper to communicate policies, respond to concerns, and reassure readers during uncertain situations. Fudge understood early in his career that maintaining a cooperative relationship with the press could be valuable. Officials who appeared in the Prophet as calm and capable administrators often gained public recognition, even if their actual work remained largely behind the scenes. While he continued his duties within the ministry, Fudge quietly built a network of professional relationships. These connections included other administrators, department staff, and political figures who influenced wizarding policy. Such relationships rarely attracted attention, but they formed the foundation of many successful political careers. Despite this growing influence, Fudge was not seen as an ambitious figure seeking power for its own sake. Those around him often described him as a practical official who simply wanted to do his job well. This perception would later play a significant role in how others viewed his suitability for higher office. At the time, the position of Minister for Magic was held by Millicent Bagnold, whose leadership during the war had earned considerable respect. Under her administration, the ministry had overseen the final defeat of Voldemort and the restoration of stability. Few people imagined that her eventual successor might come from the ranks of relatively quiet administrators. Yet politics within the ministry often developed in subtle ways. Changes in leadership could occur because of retirement, shifting public expectations, or the desire for new approaches to governance. When such moments arrived, individuals who had spent years building reputations for reliability sometimes found themselves suddenly considered for positions of great authority. By the time these political changes began approaching, Cornelius Fudge had spent many years inside the ministry's corridors. He had learned how its departments functioned, how its leaders communicated, and how decisions were shaped by both law and public perception. He had also developed a reputation that would later define much of his career. Cornelius Fudge was known not as a visionary or a radical reformer, but as someone who believed deeply in the value of order, routine, and reassurance. For a wizarding world that had only recently escaped a devastating war, those qualities seemed not only useful but necessary. And in the quiet halls of the Ministry of Magic, that reputation was slowly opening doors that would eventually lead him to the highest office in wizarding government. The leadership of the Ministry of Magic often changed quietly. Unlike many positions in the wizarding world that involved duels, discoveries, or public acclaim, the office of minister usually passed from one individual to another through political agreement and institutional decision. By the time the wizarding world had settled into the years following Voldemort's disappearance, the ministry had already spent a long period under the leadership of Millicent Bagnold. Bagnold had guided the ministry during one of the most difficult periods in modern wizarding history. Her administration faced the chaos of the First Wizarding War, when Voldemort and his followers had spread fear across Britain. During that time, the ministry struggled to maintain control, while the Auror Office fought dangerous battles against dark wizards. Many of the policies used during the war were designed simply to keep society functioning, while violence threatened to overwhelm it. When Voldemort fell, Bagnold's government became responsible for guiding the wizarding world through recovery. The trials of captured Death Eaters filled the chambers of the Wizengamot, and public officials worked to rebuild confidence in the ministry's ability to protect its citizens. For many witches and wizards, Bagnold represented the steady authority that had helped the government survive the conflict. But no administration lasts forever. Over time, political leadership within the ministry naturally moved toward transition. Some ministers stepped down voluntarily after long service, while others found their influence fading as new priorities emerged. In Bagnold's case, the years following the war gradually brought discussion about who might eventually succeed her. The wizarding world had entered a calmer period. Voldemort was gone, the Death Eaters had largely disappeared from public life, and the ministry once again focused on routine governance. During peaceful years, the qualities expected from a minister sometimes changed. Where wartime leadership demanded strength and decisive action, peacetime administration often favored careful management and public reassurance. Within the ministry itself, several individuals possessed the experience and connections that might allow them to seek the office of minister. Senior department heads, influential members of the Wizengamot, and respected Aurors all represented possible candidates. Yet the political climate of the time did not necessarily favor bold personalities. The wizarding public had grown weary of conflict. Families who had lived through years of fear now valued stability above all else. Newspapers reported on small events, school activities, and ordinary magical life rather than battles and arrests. The government understood that citizens wanted the reassurance that the terrible years of Voldemort's rise were firmly in the past. In such an atmosphere, a leader who promised calm continuity could appear far more appealing than someone who spoke about dramatic change. This environment created an opportunity for individuals who had built reputations for reliability within the ministry's bureaucracy. Cornelius Fudge was one such figure. By the time discussions about future leadership began circulating, he had already spent many years inside the ministry. His career had been marked by consistent work and cooperation with different departments. He understood how the government's machinery operated, and he had earned the trust of many colleagues. Fudge was not widely known among the general public, but within the ministry he had become familiar to many administrators. He had developed a reputation for approaching problems carefully and for maintaining relationships with officials across the institution. For senior members of the government looking toward a stable transition, those qualities carried weight. Political leadership in the wizarding world rarely depended only on personal ambition. Support from other officials often played a decisive role. Ministers needed the confidence of the Wizengamot, the cooperation of department heads, and the trust of the broader wizarding community. A candidate who could appear acceptable to all these groups often gained an advantage. Fudge's personality fit well within this environment. He was friendly, approachable, and eager to maintain good relations with colleagues. Rather than presenting himself as a visionary reformer, he emphasized practical administration and continuity. His approach suggested that the ministry would continue functioning much as it always had. Another factor that influenced his rise involved the relationship between the ministry and Albus Dumbledore. At the time, Dumbledore was widely considered the most respected wizard in Britain. His defeat of the dark wizard Grindelwald decades earlier had made him a legendary figure, and his role during the war against Voldemort had only strengthened his reputation. Many witches and wizards believed that Dumbledore himself would make an ideal minister for magic. Over the years, he had been offered the position several times. Yet each time, he declined the opportunity, preferring to remain headmaster of Hogwarts and pursue his own academic work. Dumbledore's decision not to pursue political power created space for other leaders to emerge. Those who sought the office of minister understood that the public often compared them, consciously or not, with the example of Dumbledore's wisdom. While no candidate could fully match that reputation, the absence of Dumbledore from politics made the competition for leadership more open. Within this landscape, Cornelius Fudge gradually appeared as a compromise candidate. He was experienced enough to understand the ministry's structure, yet he was not associated with any particular faction or controversial policy. For many officials, choosing Fudge represented a way to ensure that the government would continue operating smoothly. The exact moment when Fudge formally assumed the position of minister is rarely described in dramatic detail. Wizarding politics often unfolded through quiet decisions rather than public elections or grand announcements. What mattered more than the ceremony itself was the expectations surrounding his administration. When Fudge entered the minister's office, he inherited an institution shaped by centuries of tradition. The ministry's departments continued their work, regulating magical creatures, maintaining secrecy from the Muggle world, and enforcing magical law. The Wizengamot still served as the highest judicial authority, and the Auror office remained responsible for pursuing dark wizards who threatened public safety. At first, the transition appeared smooth. Fudge's administration promised continuity, with the policies that had guided the wizarding world through recovery after the war. Newspapers reported on routine ministry activities, and public life continued much as before. Fudge himself seemed comfortable in the role. He enjoyed speaking with reporters, attending official events, and presenting the image of a government that remained firmly in control. For a population that had lived through fear and uncertainty, the appearance of stability carried enormous value. Yet leadership always brings new challenges. The calm environment that allowed Fudge to rise would not remain unchanged forever. While the wizarding world believed that Voldemort's era had ended, deeper forces within magical history had not truly disappeared. For the moment, however, Cornelius Fudge stood at the center of wizarding government. His career had carried him from the quiet work of ministry offices to the highest position of authority in British magical society. And during these early days of his administration, many believed that his careful, reassuring style was exactly what the wizarding world needed. When Cornelius Fudge first settled into the office of Minister for Magic, the wizarding world had already entered a long stretch of relative calm. The horrors of Voldemort's first rise were fading into memory, and many witches and wizards preferred not to think about those years at all. The Ministry of Magic, after surviving the strain of war and the complicated aftermath that followed, now faced a very different responsibility. Instead of preparing for battles against dark wizards, it needed to maintain the appearance that everything was stable, predictable, and under control. Fudge approached this responsibility with the same mindset that had defined his earlier career. He believed that the ministry functioned best when its leaders avoided unnecessary risks. In his view, the wizarding government existed primarily to keep society running smoothly. Laws were enforced, magical secrecy was protected, and the public needed to feel confident that their leaders understood how to manage the world around them. During these early years, Fudge rarely attempted dramatic changes. Instead, his administration continued many of the policies that had already been in place. Departments within the ministry carried out their normal responsibilities without significant interruption. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement oversaw routine investigations. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures continued managing relations with magical beings. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes remained responsible for repairing incidents that threatened to expose magic to the Muggle world. To many witches and wizards, this quiet continuity seemed reassuring. The wizarding world had suffered greatly during the war, and people wanted to believe that such chaos would never return. A minister who promised calm stability often appeared far more desirable than one who spoke about new dangers. Fudge himself was well suited to maintaining that atmosphere. He enjoyed presenting the ministry as an institution that had everything under control. When reporters from the Daily Prophet asked about government activities, he responded with confident explanations that emphasized normalcy. Even when discussing problems within the magical community, he preferred to frame them as minor issues that the ministry could easily resolve. His relationship with the press soon became one of the defining features of his leadership. The Daily Prophet served as the primary newspaper for the wizarding population of Britain. Most witches and wizards relied on it to learn about government decisions, magical events, and developments within their community. Fudge understood that maintaining a cooperative relationship with the Prophet could help shape how the public viewed his administration. Reporters often found him approachable and willing to speak about ministry affairs. He enjoyed explaining policies and reassuring readers that the wizarding world remained peaceful. In many cases, the newspaper's coverage reflected this tone. Articles emphasized the ministry's competence and portrayed Fudge as a calm and practical leader. Over time, this relationship helped strengthen the public image of his administration. Citizens reading the Daily Prophet frequently encountered stories describing the ministry's steady management of magical society. Fudge appeared in photographs attending official gatherings, visiting government offices, or discussing policies with senior officials. These appearances reinforced the impression that the government was functioning smoothly. Behind the scenes, however, the ministry remained a complex institution that required constant coordination. Hundreds of employees worked across multiple departments, each responsible for a different aspect of wizarding life. Decisions made by the minister often required cooperation between offices that handled law enforcement, magical creatures, international relations, and other areas. Fudge relied heavily on experienced administrators to manage these responsibilities. Rather than personally directing every decision, he preferred to trust department heads who understood their own areas of expertise. This approach allowed the ministry's bureaucracy to operate efficiently while still presenting the minister as the figure who oversaw the entire system. Another important aspect of his leadership involved maintaining relationships with influential figures in the wizarding world. Individuals such as Albus Dumbledore carried enormous respect among witches and wizards. Even though Dumbledore held no formal political office within the ministry, his opinions often carried significant weight. During the early years of Fudge's administration, the two maintained a cooperative relationship. Fudge recognized that Dumbledore's wisdom and reputation could be valuable to the government. On several occasions, he consulted with him about important matters, particularly those involving magical security or historical knowledge. This cooperation helped reinforce the perception that the wizarding government and Hogwarts were working together to guide society after the war. Students continued their education without disruption, magical businesses thrived, and everyday life seemed far removed from the terror that had once defined Voldemort's reign. At the same time, Fudge believed strongly in the importance of authority and order. He viewed the ministry as the central institution responsible for guiding wizarding society. While he respected figures such as Dumbledore, he also believed that final decisions about government policy should rest within the ministry itself. For several years, this balance between cooperation and authority appeared stable. The wizarding world continued functioning peacefully, and Fudge's cautious leadership did not face serious challenges. Minor incidents occurred from time to time, but they rarely threatened the broader sense of calm that defined the era. In many ways, this period represented the ideal environment for a leader like Cornelius Fudge. His natural instinct toward caution aligned perfectly with the expectations of the public. Witches and wizards wanted reassurance that the ministry remained vigilant but not alarmed. They preferred leaders who spoke about stability rather than danger. Fudge's speeches and public appearances reflected this philosophy. When addressing gatherings or responding to questions from reporters, he emphasized the strength of the ministry and the success of its departments. The message was always clear. The wizarding world had survived its darkest years, and under his leadership, it would continue moving forward safely. Yet even in these peaceful times, certain decisions revealed deeper assumptions about how the ministry should govern. Fudge believed strongly in maintaining traditional systems that had existed for generations. One example was the continued use of Dementors as guards at Azkaban prison. Many witches and wizards disliked the presence of these creatures, whose ability to drain happiness made them deeply feared. However, the ministry had relied on Dementors to guard its most dangerous prisoners for many years. Fudge saw no reason to change this arrangement. In his view, the Dementors were effective at preventing escapes and maintaining control over Azkaban. This decision reflected a broader pattern in his leadership. Rather than questioning long-standing practices, Fudge preferred to preserve the structures that had existed before him. Stability, in his mind, depended on maintaining systems that already worked. For a time, this approach seemed reasonable. The wizarding world remained quiet, and the ministry faced no immediate threats. Newspapers reported on Quidditch matches, magical innovations, and social gatherings rather than political crises. Within the ministry itself, many officials appreciated the sense of predictability that defined Fudge's administration. Departments operated without constant upheaval, and policies changed slowly if at all. Employees could focus on their responsibilities without worrying that dramatic reforms might suddenly alter their work. Yet leadership, during peaceful years, can sometimes hide deeper weaknesses. When a government grows accustomed to calm, it may begin to assume that the future will resemble the present. Decisions that seem sensible during stability may become dangerous when circumstances begin to change. During these early years, Cornelius Fudge believed firmly that his careful style of leadership was preserving the wizarding world's hard-won peace. From his perspective, the ministry stood strong, the public trusted its government, and the frightening days of Voldemort's power had passed into history. For the moment, It appeared that the wizarding world had indeed entered a long period of safety. And at the center of that calm stood a minister whose greatest strength seemed to be his ability to reassure everyone that nothing truly dangerous remained. One of the most important relationships in Cornelius Fudge's political life was his connection with Albus Dumbledore. At the time Fudge rose to power, Dumbledore was widely regarded as the most respected wizard in Britain. His reputation stretched far beyond Hogwarts. He had defeated the dark wizard Gellert Grindelwald decades earlier, and during the rise of Voldemort he had played a crucial role in organizing resistance through the Order of the Phoenix. Many witches and wizards trusted Dumbledore's judgment more than that of any government official. Because of this reputation, Dumbledore had been offered the position of Minister for Magic more than once. Each time, he refused. Dumbledore believed that power, particularly political power, was not something he should seek. Instead, he chose to remain headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where he could guide younger generations and pursue his studies of magic. When Cornelius Fudge became minister, he understood that Dumbledore's influence within the wizarding world could not be ignored. Although Dumbledore held no official role in the ministry, his opinions carried enormous weight. Citizens trusted him, teachers respected him, and even many ministry officials quietly admired him. In the early years of Fudge's administration, this relationship worked to the minister's advantage. Fudge often consulted Dumbledore when facing difficult questions. Whether the topic involved magical history, security concerns, or unusual magical phenomena, Dumbledore possessed knowledge that few others could match. For Fudge, this guidance was extremely valuable. While he had spent years working within the ministry's bureaucracy, he did not possess the same depth of magical scholarship or battlefield experience that defined figures like Dumbledore. Seeking advice from someone with such wisdom helped him appear thoughtful and responsible as a leader. At the same time, the arrangement benefited the ministry as well. When the public knew that Dumbledore and the minister were on good terms, it created a sense of unity within wizarding leadership. Citizens believed that the government and Hogwarts were working together to ensure stability and safety. In those early years, Fudge spoke of Dumbledore with respect. He acknowledged the headmaster's intelligence and frequently referred to him as a trusted advisor. Their conversations were often cordial, and when important matters arose, Fudge did not hesitate to visit Hogwarts or invite Dumbledore to the ministry. The balance between them, however, was unusual. Officially, Cornelius Fudge held the highest political authority in the wizarding world. Yet in the minds of many witches and wizards, Dumbledore's moral authority seemed even greater. People trusted his judgment not because he held power, but because of the integrity he had demonstrated throughout his life. Fudge was aware of this perception, though during the early years it did not trouble him. In fact, having Dumbledore's quiet support strengthened the image of his administration. As long as the two appeared to cooperate, the wizarding world saw little reason to doubt the ministry's leadership. Their cooperation extended to several important matters. Hogwarts remained under the oversight of the Ministry of Magic, though the school operated largely independently in daily affairs. When decisions affected the safety of students or the broader magical community, the ministry sometimes consulted with Dumbledore to ensure that their actions were appropriate. During these early years, such conversations were usually calm and practical. The wizarding world seemed peaceful, and neither the ministry nor Hogwarts faced the kind of emergencies that had once dominated government attention. Yet the relationship between political leaders and respected independent figures can sometimes be delicate. While Fudge valued Dumbledore's advice, he also believed strongly in the authority of the ministry. In his mind, the government remained the final decision-maker on matters of public policy. This distinction rarely created problems while the wizarding world remained calm, but the potential tension between political authority and independent influence quietly existed beneath the surface. Another factor shaping their relationship involved public perception. Many witches and wizards admired Dumbledore so deeply that they occasionally wondered why he had never accepted the office of minister himself. In casual conversation, people sometimes suggested that the wizarding world might be safer if he were in charge of the government. For Fudge, such comparisons could be uncomfortable. Although he had earned the position of minister through years of service, the public's admiration for Dumbledore sometimes overshadowed his own authority. Yet during the early years of his administration, these feelings remained subtle rather than openly expressed. Dumbledore himself did little to encourage political influence. He rarely involved himself in ministry debates unless a situation required his expertise. His primary responsibilities remained at Hogwarts, where he focused on education and the development of young witches and wizards. Because of this restraint, the balance between them remained stable for many years. Fudge governed the ministry, while Dumbledore continued guiding the magical world through his role as headmaster and scholar. Their occasional conversations reflected a shared interest in preserving the peace that had followed Voldemort's defeat. To observers within the wizarding community, this cooperation seemed natural. The ministry represented governmental authority, while Dumbledore represented wisdom and experience. Together, they appeared to form a steady foundation for wizarding society. Fudge often relied on this perception when speaking to reporters or attending public events. Mentioning that he had consulted Dumbledore on certain matters helped reassure citizens that important decisions were being made carefully. It suggested that the government was not acting alone, but with the guidance of one of the greatest wizards of the age. For a time, this arrangement worked perfectly. The wizarding world remained peaceful, the ministry functioned smoothly, and Hogwarts continued educating new generations of students. Few people imagined that the relationship between Fudge and Dumbledore would eventually become strained. Yet leadership during calm periods can sometimes hide deeper differences in philosophy. Fudge believed strongly in maintaining stability and public confidence above all else. Dumbledore, on the other hand, understood that threats to the wizarding world often emerged quietly before becoming impossible to ignore. During the early years of their cooperation, these differences remained mostly unspoken. Fudge saw the wizarding world as stable and secure. Dumbledore, while hopeful, remained watchful. For the moment, however, their partnership helped maintain the sense that the wizarding world was united under capable leadership. The ministry governed daily life, Hogwarts nurtured the next generation, and the memories of the war slowly faded into history. And as long as that peace lasted, Cornelius Fudge had every reason to believe that his careful leadership and his friendly relationship with Albus Dumbledore would keep the wizarding world safe. Deep in the cold waters of the North Sea stood one of the most feared places in the wizarding world. Azkaban prison had existed for generations as the Ministry of Magic's primary location for holding the most dangerous witches and wizards. Surrounded by dark waves and constant storms, the fortress was isolated from the rest of society. Very few people ever saw its interior, and even fewer wished to. The reputation of Azkaban did not come from its stone walls alone. What truly made the prison terrifying were its guards. Dementors, dark creatures that fed on human happiness, patrolled the corridors of the fortress. Wherever they gathered, warmth and hope seemed to fade. Their presence filled the air with despair, leaving prisoners trapped not only behind bars but inside their own worst memories. For many years, the Ministry of Magic had relied on Dementors to guard its most dangerous criminals. The creatures possessed abilities that made them effective wardens. Their presence weakened prisoners physically and mentally, leaving them with little strength to attempt escape. In addition, Dementors were capable of sensing human emotion, making it difficult for prisoners to hide their intentions. When Cornelius Fudge became Minister for Magic, this system was already firmly established. Azkaban had long been considered secure, and the ministry saw little reason to change the arrangement. From a practical perspective, the prison functioned as intended. Dangerous criminals remained contained, and the wizarding public believed that those who threatened society would remain far away from ordinary life. Fudge viewed the situation through the lens of stability. In his mind, the ministry's responsibility was to preserve order, If a system had worked for many years, altering it could introduce unnecessary risk. The use of Dementors as prison guards, however unsettling it might seem, had proven effective. Many witches and wizards disliked the idea of Dementors serving the government. Stories about their presence circulated widely throughout magical communities. People described the chilling sensation that surrounded them, the way their presence seemed to drain joy from the air itself. Few individuals willingly approached these creatures unless they had no choice. Despite these concerns, the ministry continued defending the practice. Officials argued that the Dementors kept Azkaban secure without requiring large numbers of auras or guards. The creatures had little interest in politics or ideology. They existed only to feed on despair, and the prison provided them with a constant supply of victims. For Cornelius Fudge, this arrangement represented a practical solution rather than a moral question. As minister, he often focused on whether a policy maintained order and protected the wizarding world. Azkaban remained secure, and prisoners rarely escaped. From the perspective of government administration, the system appeared successful. During the years following Voldemort's defeat, Azkaban held many of the most notorious Death Eaters who had been captured after the war. Figures such as Bellatrix Lestrange and her allies remained imprisoned within the fortress, guarded constantly by the Dementors. Their presence served as a reminder of the terror the wizarding world had endured. For the public, the existence of Azkaban provided reassurance. Knowing that dangerous dark wizards were locked away helped restore confidence in the ministry's ability to protect society. Even those who feared the Dementors often accepted their role as guardians if it meant that criminals would remain contained. Fudge frequently spoke about Azkaban with the certainty of someone who believed the prison represented the strength of wizarding law. In conversations with reporters and officials, he emphasized the importance of maintaining a firm response to dark magic. The ministry, he believed, needed institutions that demonstrated its authority. Yet the presence of Dementors created a deeper issue that few government officials fully considered. These creatures were not loyal in the way human guards might be. They did not share the ministry's values or its sense of responsibility toward the wizarding community. Their allegiance existed only as long as their hunger for despair continued to be satisfied. Some witches and wizards, including Albus Dumbledore, openly questioned the wisdom of relying on such creatures. Dumbledore had long expressed concern that the ministry was trusting beings whose nature could not truly be controlled. He believed that giving Dementors a role within government authority might one day lead to consequences that could not easily be undone. During the peaceful years of Fudge's administration, however, these warnings seemed distant. The wizarding world had experienced few serious threats since Voldemort's fall. Azkaban remained secure, and the Dementors continued performing their grim duties. Fudge often visited the prison in his role as minister, though such visits were rarely pleasant. The fortress was a bleak place, surrounded by cold winds and endless grey sea. Even strong witches and wizards found the presence of Dementors deeply unsettling. Their ability to draw out a person's darkest memories created an atmosphere where hope seemed to disappear. Despite these conditions, the prison's security record reinforced Fudge's confidence in the system. Escapes were nearly unheard of. Prisoners weakened quickly under the influence of the Dementors, leaving them with little strength to attempt rebellion. For a minister who valued stability and order, this reliability was difficult to ignore. Azkaban represented a solution that had worked for generations. Replacing the Dementors with human guards would require enormous resources and introduce new risks. At the same time, the prison symbolized the ministry's willingness to use frightening methods to enforce law. The Dementors' presence served as a warning to anyone who might consider following the path of dark magic. The message was simple and clear. Those who threatened the wizarding world would face consequences far worse than ordinary imprisonment. Throughout these years, Cornelius Fudge rarely questioned the system he had inherited. The ministry's responsibility, as he saw it, was to maintain order in a world that had already suffered from chaos. Azkaban, guarded by Dementors, remained one of the strongest tools available to ensure that order. Yet history has a way of revealing the weaknesses within systems that once appeared secure. While the prison seemed unbreakable, its reliance on creatures, driven only by despair, meant that its foundation rested on something deeply unstable. For the moment, however, the wizarding world believed that Azkaban stood as an unshakable fortress. Under Cornelius Fudge's administration, the Ministry continued trusting the Dementors to guard its most dangerous prisoners, confident that the system, which had worked for so long, would continue protecting the wizarding world from those who threatened it. For many years after Voldemort's defeat, the wizarding world experienced a period of relative calm. The Ministry of Magic continued managing its responsibilities, and the public grew accustomed to the belief that the worst dangers had already passed. Cornelius Fudge's administration benefited from this sense of stability. His leadership style, focused on reassurance and careful governance, seemed perfectly suited to a peaceful era. That sense of calm was shaken when news emerged from the most secure prison in the wizarding world. Sirius Black, a prisoner held within Azkaban since the end of the war, had escaped. The announcement spread quickly across magical Britain. Azkaban had a reputation for being impossible to escape. The fortress was surrounded by cold sea, guarded by Dementors, and designed to hold the most dangerous witches and wizards ever captured. The idea that a prisoner had broken free was almost unimaginable. What made the escape even more alarming was the identity of the prisoner. Sirius Black was widely believed to be one of the most dangerous followers Voldemort had ever possessed. According to the official account accepted by the Ministry, Black had betrayed James and Lily Potter to the Dark Lord during the war. After Voldemort's fall, he had confronted Peter Pettigrew in a crowded Muggle street, resulting in an explosion that killed 12 bystanders. Black had been arrested shortly afterward and sent directly to Azkaban without a formal trial. Witnesses remembered the scene as one of the most shocking incidents in the aftermath of the war. The wizarding world viewed Sirius Black not only as a murderer, but as the man responsible for delivering the Potters to Voldemort. For the Ministry, the escape represented a crisis that demanded immediate response. Cornelius Fudge understood that the public would expect swift action. If the wizarding government could not contain one of its most notorious prisoners, confidence in its authority could quickly collapse. Fudge personally visited Azkaban soon after the escape was discovered. The fortress, normally silent except for the movements of Dementors, had become a place of intense concern. Officials searched for explanations that might reveal how such a breach had occurred. Yet the circumstances of the escape remained deeply mysterious. According to the Dementors, they had sensed no unusual activity before Black vanished. The creatures could detect human presence and emotion, making it extremely difficult for prisoners to hide their intentions. Yet somehow, Sirius Black had managed to slip past them and leave the fortress behind. The lack of a clear explanation made the situation even more troubling. If Azkaban's defenses could fail without warning, it meant that the Ministry's most secure institution might not be as reliable as everyone believed. Fudge understood that the wizarding world would soon learn about the escape. The Daily Prophet quickly began publishing articles describing the danger posed by Black. The newspaper emphasized his history as a supporter of Voldemort and his connection to the deaths of the Potters. For many readers, the news brought back memories of the war they had hoped to forget. The Ministry responded by launching a massive search effort. Auras were dispatched across the country to track any sign of the escaped prisoner. Magical communities were warned to remain vigilant, and the public was reminded that Sirius Black was considered extremely dangerous. One of the most dramatic steps taken by the Ministry involved cooperation with the Muggle government. Because Black had once been responsible for an explosion in a Muggle street, the Ministry feared he might again appear in non-magical areas. To address this risk, the wizarding government secretly informed the Muggle Prime Minister that a dangerous criminal had escaped custody. Within the Muggle world, the the search for Black was conducted through ordinary law enforcement. Photographs of his gaunt face appeared on posters, and police were instructed to remain alert. Of course, they had no understanding of the magical circumstances behind the escape. Meanwhile, the wizarding government pursued its own search using magical means. Auras questioned witnesses, examined possible hiding places, and attempted to predict Black's movements. Yet days passed without any clear trace of the fugitive. For Cornelius Fudge, the situation carried personal pressure as well as political consequences. As Minister for Magic, he was responsible for ensuring the safety of the wizarding population. The escape of a prisoner like Sirius Black threatened to undermine the public's faith in the ministry's competence. Fudge responded by emphasizing the seriousness of the threat in conversations with reporters and officials. He described Black as a highly dangerous wizard whose capture was essential for the security of the wizarding world. His statements reinforced the urgency of the search, while also demonstrating that the government was taking the matter seriously. The ministry's concerns became even greater when intelligence suggested that Black might attempt to reach Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Harry Potter, the child believed to have survived Voldemort's attack because of his parents' sacrifice, was now a student at the school. According to the ministry's understanding of Black's motives, Harry could be a potential target. If Black truly blamed the boy for Voldemort's downfall, he might attempt to finish what the Dark Lord had started years earlier. This possibility created an immediate dilemma for the government. Hogwarts had always been considered one of the safest places in the wizarding world. Yet if Black truly intended to reach the castle, the ministry needed to strengthen its defenses. Fudge eventually approved a controversial decision. Dementors from Azkaban would be stationed around the grounds of Hogwarts to guard the school. Their presence would create a barrier that few criminals would dare approach. The decision was not universally welcomed. Many witches and wizards felt uneasy about placing creatures associated with despair so close to a school filled with children. Even Albus Dumbledore expressed clear discomfort with the plan, warning that Dementors were not creatures that could be trusted. Despite these concerns, the ministry believed the measure was necessary. The escape of Sirius Black had already demonstrated that Azkaban was not completely secure. If the prisoner attempted to reach Hogwarts, the government wanted every possible protection in place. As the search continued, the wizarding world watched anxiously for news. Every report of suspicious movement, every rumor of a sighting, added to the tension spreading through magical communities. For Cornelius Fudge, the crisis represented the first major test of his leadership as Minister for Magic. The escape had shattered the illusion that Azkaban was completely secure. Now, the government needed to prove that it could still protect the wizarding world from the dangers that had once nearly destroyed it. And somewhere beyond the ministry's reach, the escaped prisoner continued moving through the shadows of the wizarding world, carrying secrets that almost no one yet understood. As the search for Sirius Black expanded across the wizarding world, attention increasingly focused on a place that had always been considered one of the safest locations in magical Britain. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had stood for centuries as a place of learning, protected by ancient enchantments and guided by experienced teachers. Yet the possibility that Black might attempt to reach the school forced the Ministry of Magic to reconsider how secure even Hogwarts truly was. Cornelius Fudge understood that the situation carried both practical and political risks. The public believed that Sirius Black was a loyal servant of Voldemort who had betrayed the Potters and murdered innocent people. If such a figure managed to reach the grounds of Hogwarts, it would represent not only a personal threat to Harry Potter, but also a major failure for the ministry's ability to protect the wizarding community. The minister, therefore, began working closely with the leadership of the school. Albus Dumbledore remained headmaster, and his authority within Hogwarts was unquestioned. Yet the ministry still held responsibility for ensuring that the wider wizarding world remained safe. This created a delicate balance between government oversight and the independence Hogwarts traditionally enjoyed. During discussions between the ministry and the school, the central concern remained clear. If Black intended to approach Hogwarts, the government needed a method of preventing him from entering the grounds. The castle's magical defenses were powerful, but the Ministry believed additional protection might be necessary. Fudge ultimately approved a controversial measure. Dementors from Azkaban would be stationed around Hogwarts to guard the surrounding area. Their presence would act as a barrier against Black, whose experience in Azkaban meant he would immediately recognize the danger posed by these creatures. From the Ministry's perspective, the decision seemed logical. Dementors had guarded the most dangerous prison in the wizarding world for generations. Their ability to sense human emotion made them extremely effective at detecting intruders. Placing them around the school appeared to provide an additional layer of security that few criminals would attempt to challenge. Yet, the plan immediately raised concerns among several members of the wizarding community. Dementors were feared even by experienced witches and wizards. Their presence created an atmosphere of despair that could affect anyone nearby. For students attending Hogwarts, many of whom were still young and inexperienced with the darker aspects of magic, such creatures represented something deeply unsettling. Albus Dumbledore expressed his reservations openly. Although he understood the Ministry's desire to capture Sirius Black, he did not trust Dementors to operate safely around children. Their hunger for human happiness was not something that could be fully controlled. Dumbledore warned that allowing them near the school might create dangers of its own. Cornelius Fudge listened to these concerns, but remained firm in his decision. In his view, the threat posed by Sirius Black justified extraordinary precautions. If Black truly intended to harm Harry Potter, failing to act could have devastating consequences. The Ministry therefore insisted that the Dementors remain stationed outside the school grounds. Soon after the new school year began, students traveling to Hogwarts encountered the first signs of this unusual security presence. The Hogwarts Express, which carried pupils from London to the castle, was briefly stopped during the journey so that Dementors could search the train for the escaped prisoner. The sudden appearance of the creatures left a powerful impression on many students. Their tall, shadowed forms moved silently through the train's corridors. Wherever they passed, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air grew heavy with unease. Some students experienced the unsettling sensation of hearing distant echoes of their worst memories. For young witches and wizards encountering Dementors for the first time, the experience was deeply disturbing. Although the search revealed no sign of Sirius Black, the event made it clear that the Ministry was treating the threat with absolute seriousness. The Dementors continued traveling around the area near Hogwarts, patrolling the forests and grounds surrounding the castle. Within the school itself, the presence of these creatures quickly became a subject of constant discussion. Students whispered about them in corridors and classrooms, sharing stories about the strange feelings that accompanied their presence. Even the teachers remained cautious, aware that Dementors were unpredictable beings. Fudge continued monitoring the situation through reports from Ministry officials and communication with Hogwarts. Publicly, he emphasized that the measures were necessary to ensure the safety of the wizarding world. In interviews with the Daily Prophet, he described the search for Sirius Black as the Ministry's highest priority. For many witches and wizards reading these reports, the situation brought back memories of the fear that had once dominated their lives during Voldemort's rise. The idea that one of his former followers was roaming free reminded people that the past had not entirely disappeared. At the same time, some observers quietly questioned whether the Ministry's response might be excessive. Hogwarts had always been protected by powerful magic, and Dumbledore's presence alone had long served as a deterrent to dark wizards. The decision to surround the school with Dementors felt to some like an admission that the government did not fully trust its own institutions. Cornelius Fudge did not see the matter that way. From his perspective, the responsibility of leadership required visible action during times of uncertainty. Allowing the public to believe that the Ministry was ignoring a potential threat could damage confidence in the government. By placing Dementors around Hogwarts, Fudge hoped to send a clear message. The Ministry was determined to capture Sirius Black, and it would use every available resource to ensure that the wizarding world remained safe. As the school year progressed, however, the search for Black continued without success. Despite the presence of Dementors and the efforts of Aurors across the country, no reliable trace of the escaped prisoner appeared. The wizarding world watched and waited, uncertain where the fugitive might appear next. And at Hogwarts, beneath the shadow of the Dementors patrolling the grounds, students continued their studies while the Ministry searched desperately for the man it believed to be one of the most dangerous criminals in magical history. As the school year continued under the watch of the Dementors, the Ministry of Magic remained focused on the search for Sirius Black. Cornelius Fudge received frequent reports from Aurors and Ministry officials tracking possible sightings of the escaped prisoner. Despite the urgency of the investigation, reliable information proved difficult to obtain. Black had vanished after leaving Azkaban, and weeks passed without any confirmed location. The wizarding public followed the situation closely through reports in the Daily Prophet. Each article reminded readers that a dangerous criminal remained at large. Fudge's statements emphasized the seriousness of the threat, while reassuring citizens that the Ministry was doing everything possible to locate Black. Inside Hogwarts, however, events unfolded in ways that the Ministry did not fully understand. The school remained protected by ancient enchantments, and Albus Dumbledore maintained strict oversight of its security. Although the Dementors patrolled the surrounding grounds, they did not enter the castle itself. Dumbledore had made it clear that their presence would not extend beyond the perimeter. Students continued their lessons, Quidditch matches were played, and the routines of school life carried on. Yet the knowledge that Sirius Black might be somewhere nearby lingered in the background of everyday conversation. Rumors spread quickly among the students, and stories about the escaped prisoner grew more dramatic with each retelling. At several points during the year, unusual incidents within the castle seemed to suggest that Black might have reached Hogwarts after all. A break-in at the Gryffindor dormitory created particular concern. Although nothing was stolen and no students were harmed, the event caused alarm throughout the school. When news of the break-in reached the Ministry, Cornelius Fudge immediately treated it as evidence that Sirius Black had indeed attempted to reach Harry Potter. The possibility seemed to confirm the Ministry's belief that Black intended to complete the task that Voldemort had once begun. Fudge's response reflected the same cautious determination that had guided his earlier decisions. He continued supporting the presence of Dementors around the school and urged Ministry officials to intensify their search efforts. From his perspective, every strange event reinforced the idea that Black was still attempting to reach Hogwarts. Yet the truth of what was happening inside the castle remained hidden from the Ministry. While officials assumed that Black was a loyal servant of Voldemort, the reality was far more complicated. Sirius Black had not escaped Azkaban in order to continue the Dark Lord's work. Instead, he had escaped because he believed that Peter Pettigrew, another former member of Voldemort's circle, was still alive and hiding within the wizarding world. This secret, however, was known only to a small number of individuals. The Ministry's understanding of the situation remained shaped by the events recorded years earlier. According to official records, Pettigrew had been killed in the explosion that occurred when Black confronted him after Voldemort's fall. Witnesses remembered only the destruction and the apparent death of Pettigrew. Because of this belief, the Ministry saw Black as both a murderer and a traitor, responsible for delivering the Potters to Voldemort. Fudge had no reason to question that narrative. The evidence available to the government seemed clear, and no alternative explanation had ever been presented. As the year moved toward its final months, the situation suddenly changed. Events at Hogwarts brought the truth about Sirius Black much closer to the surface. Black managed to enter the castle and eventually confronted Peter Pettigrew, who had been living for years disguised as a rat belonging to the Weasley family. During this confrontation, Harry Potter and several others learned the truth about what had really happened on the night the Potters died. Pettigrew, not Black, had betrayed James and Lily to Voldemort. After Voldemort's fall, Pettigrew had faked his own death and framed Black for the crime before disappearing into hiding. The revelation completely transformed the meaning of Sirius Black's escape. Rather than seeking revenge against Harry Potter, he had been searching for the true traitor responsible for the Potters' deaths. Unfortunately for Black, the Ministry did not witness these events. When the situation finally reached the attention of government officials, the evidence available to them appeared to confirm the version of events they already believed. Cornelius Fudge personally arrived at Hogwarts after Black was captured. The Ministry had been informed that the escaped prisoner was now in custody. From the Minister's perspective, the crisis that had troubled the wizarding world for months was finally coming to an end. Fudge showed little interest in reconsidering the case against Sirius Black. The official record already described Black as a murderer and a supporter of Voldemort. The fact that he had escaped from Azkaban only reinforced the belief that he remained dangerous. Although Harry Potter and others attempted to explain the truth about Peter Pettigrew, the situation quickly grew complicated. Pettigrew escaped before he could be presented as evidence, leaving no proof that could easily overturn the Ministry's assumptions. Without that evidence, Fudge saw no reason to doubt the original judgment. From his perspective, Sirius Black had escaped from prison, infiltrated Hogwarts, and continued demonstrating the behavior of a dangerous criminal. Before the Ministry could transport Black back to Azkaban, however, events took another unexpected turn. Black managed to escape once more, this time with the help of Harry Potter and Hermione Granger. Using the magical abilities of Buckbeak the Hippogriff, he fled the castle and disappeared into the night. By the time Fudge and the other officials realized what had happened, Black was already gone. The escaped prisoner, who had caused months of fear, had once again slipped beyond the Ministry's reach. For Cornelius Fudge, the situation created a complicated conclusion. On one hand, the Ministry had succeeded in locating Sirius Black and confirming that he was alive. On the other hand, the government had failed to recapture him permanently. Yet without proof of Black's innocence, and with Pettigrew still missing, the official story remained unchanged. The Ministry continued listing Sirius Black as a dangerous fugitive, responsible for crimes committed during the First War. In Fudge's mind, the events at Hogwarts confirmed the narrative he already believed. The escaped prisoner had attempted to reach the school, caused disruption, and then fled when confronted. Although the final outcome was frustrating, the overall situation appeared to reinforce the Ministry's understanding of the case. The wizarding public eventually returned to its ordinary routines, though the mystery of Black's escape remained unresolved. The government continued searching for the fugitive, but over time the intensity of the hunt began to fade. For Cornelius Fudge, the crisis had been difficult but manageable. The Ministry had responded quickly, strengthened security around Hogwarts, and kept the public informed through the Daily Prophet. From his perspective, the government had handled the situation responsibly. Yet hidden within those events was a truth the Ministry had completely failed to recognize. Sirius Black was not the villain they believed him to be, and the real traitor who had served Voldemort was still free in the wizarding world. After the long search for Sirius Black finally faded from the front pages of the Daily Prophet, the wizarding world slowly returned to a sense of normal life. The Ministry of Magic continued its usual work, and Cornelius Fudge once again focused on presenting the government as calm and dependable. For many witches and wizards, the frightening events of the previous year seemed to confirm that the Ministry had acted decisively to protect the public. It was during this quieter period that a new opportunity appeared for the wizarding world to celebrate cooperation rather than fear. The Triwizard Tournament, an ancient magical competition between 3 European wizarding schools, had not been held for many years. The tournament had originally been suspended after repeated tragedies involving student champions. The challenges were notoriously dangerous, and over time, the competition developed a reputation for risk that even experienced witches and wizards considered excessive. Despite this history, the Ministry of Magic eventually decided to revive the tournament as a symbol of international unity. The wizarding governments of Britain, France, and Bulgaria believed that the event could strengthen ties between their magical communities. By demonstrating cooperation between schools and ministries, the tournament would show that the wizarding world had moved beyond the fear and suspicion that once defined the years of Voldemort's rise. Cornelius Fudge strongly supported the decision. From his perspective, the tournament represented exactly the kind of event that could reinforce public confidence in the ministry's leadership. Hosting such a historic competition would place Britain at the center of wizarding attention, allowing the government to showcase its stability and organization. The ministry therefore began preparing for the tournament with considerable enthusiasm. Officials worked alongside Hogwarts to ensure that the event would be conducted safely. Special rules were introduced to prevent younger students from entering the competition, and magical protections were designed to limit the risks faced by the champions. Fudge himself took a visible interest in the preparations. As Minister for Magic, he attended meetings with foreign officials and helped coordinate the arrival of the visiting schools. His presence at these discussions reflected both his political authority and his desire to present the ministry as a confident host for the international gathering. 2 other schools were invited to participate in the revived tournament. Bogsbatten's Academy of Magic, located in France, and Durmstrang Institute, a school known for its focus on powerful magical training, would each send a delegation of students and staff to Hogwarts. The arrival of these schools would bring witches and wizards from across Europe together in a rare moment of cooperation. For the wizarding public, the announcement of the tournament created excitement. Newspapers reported on the history of the competition and speculated about which students might be chosen as champions. The Daily Prophet published interviews with ministry officials who described the event as a celebration of magical skill and friendship between nations. Fudge's administration welcomed this attention. After years spent responding to crises such as the escape of Sirius Black, the ministry now had an opportunity to highlight a positive event that emphasized unity and progress. The tournament allowed the government to shift the public conversation away from fear and toward pride in the wizarding world's traditions. When the visiting schools finally arrived at Hogwarts, the atmosphere within the castle changed dramatically. Students gathered to watch the entrances of Bogsbatten's and Durmstrang, marveling at the magical transportation methods that carried them to Britain. For many young witches and wizards, it was the first time they had seen students from other magical communities. The central moment of the tournament's beginning came with the presentation of the Goblet of Fire. This ancient magical artifact would select one champion from each participating school. The chosen students would represent their institutions in a series of dangerous challenges designed to test their magical ability, courage, and intelligence. Ministry officials attended the ceremony alongside the staff of Hogwarts. Fudge himself observed the proceedings with interest, confident that the carefully prepared rules would ensure a safe and impressive competition. When the Goblet of Fire produced its selections, 3 names emerged as expected. One champion came from Hogwarts, another from Bogsbatten's, and a third from Durmstrang. The audience applauded the chosen students, recognizing that they would soon face the challenges that defined the tournament. Yet moments later, the goblet produced a 4th name. The unexpected selection of Harry Potter shocked everyone present. Harry was far younger than the age limit established by the tournament rules, and he had not entered his name into the competition. The appearance of his name raised immediate questions about how the magical protections surrounding the goblet had been bypassed. For Cornelius Fudge, the situation was troubling but not immediately alarming. Magical competitions had always contained elements of unpredictability, and the Goblet of Fire possessed powerful magic of its own. Although the event was unusual, Fudge trusted the experts responsible for managing the tournament to handle the situation. The ministry's focus remained on ensuring that the competition continued smoothly. Officials consulted with Albus Dumbledore and other authorities about whether Harry should be allowed to participate. Ultimately, the magical contract created by the goblet meant that the boy could not simply withdraw from the tournament. While this decision caused concern among some observers, Fudge continued viewing the tournament primarily as a symbol of international cooperation. The ministry's role was to oversee the event and ensure that it reflected well on the wizarding government. Throughout the months that followed, the tournament drew enormous attention from across magical Europe. Each challenge was reported in the Daily Prophet, and readers followed the progress of the champions with fascination. The Ministry presented the competition as proof that the wizarding world had entered a new era of collaboration. For Fudge, the tournament represented an ideal political moment. Instead of discussing dark wizards or escaped prisoners, the wizarding public focused on skill, courage, and tradition. The Ministry stood at the center of an event that united magical communities rather than dividing them. Yet, beneath the excitement of the tournament, forces were quietly moving that the Ministry did not fully understand. The selection of Harry Potter had not been an accident. Unknown to Fudge and many others, the event had been manipulated by individuals whose goals were far more dangerous than a simple magical competition. For the moment, however, Cornelius Fudge saw the Triwizard Tournament as a triumph for his administration. The wizarding world had gathered peacefully at Hogwarts. International cooperation seemed stronger than ever, and the Ministry of Magic appeared to be guiding the magical community through a confident and stable era. What Fudge could not yet see was that the final challenge of the tournament would soon bring the wizarding world face to face with a danger many believed had already been defeated forever. The Triwizard Tournament had been planned as a celebration of magical unity, but its final moments would become one of the most important turning points in the modern history of the wizarding world. For months, the competition had drawn attention from witches and wizards across Europe. Each challenge had been watched closely, reported in newspapers, and discussed in homes and common rooms. By the time the final task approached, the tournament had become the center of public fascination. Cornelius Fudge continued observing the event with the confidence of a leader who believed the Ministry had successfully guided the wizarding world into a period of peace. The competition had brought together students from 3 different schools, and despite a few unusual complications, the tournament seemed to be proceeding under careful supervision. The final challenge was designed as a test of skill, determination, and intelligence. A large maze had been constructed on the Hogwarts grounds, filled with magical obstacles and creatures that would test the champions as they searched for the Triwizard Cup. The first champion to reach the cup at the center of the maze would win the tournament for their school. As the evening began, the audience gathered around the towering walls of the maze. Teachers, students, and Ministry officials watched closely as the champions entered the twisting paths of the magical labyrinth. Among them was Harry Potter, the youngest champion ever to compete in the tournament. What the crowd could not see was that the cup waiting at the center of the maze had been secretly transformed into a portkey. The object was no longer simply a prize for the tournament's winner. It had become part of a much darker plan that had been unfolding quietly throughout the year. When Harry Potter and Cedric Diggory reached the center of the maze together, they agreed to touch the cup at the same moment. The instant their hands made contact with the object, both boys were pulled away from the Hogwarts grounds by the magic of the portkey. They arrived in a place far removed from the cheers of the crowd. Instead of the school grounds, they found themselves standing in a graveyard under a dark sky. Ancient tombstones surrounded them, and a cold silence hung in the air. Within moments, the trap revealed itself. Cedric Diggory was killed by Peter Pettigrew, who had been working in secret to prepare the return of his master. Harry was captured and bound, while Pettigrew completed the final steps of a dark ritual. Using Harry's blood, a bone from the grave of Tom Riddle's father, and his own hand as a sacrifice, Pettigrew restored Voldemort to a physical body. The Dark Wizard, who had vanished years earlier in Godric's Hollow, now stood alive once more. For Voldemort, the return was not simply an act of survival. It was the beginning of a new campaign to reclaim power. He summoned his remaining followers, the Death Eaters, to the graveyard and announced that the boy who had once survived his attack would now die before them. Harry managed to escape only through an extraordinary chain of events involving the magic of the twin cores shared by his wand and Voldemort's. The connection between their wands created a rare magical phenomenon that allowed Harry to break free and reached the portkey once more. When he returned to Hogwarts, he carried the body of Cedric Diggory with him. The sight of the two boys appearing on the grounds shocked the crowd that had gathered to watch the tournament conclude. The celebration immediately turned into confusion and grief. Cedric had been one of the most respected students at Hogwarts, and his death was a devastating shock. Teachers quickly moved the students away from the scene, while Harry was taken to safety. It was there that Harry began telling the story of what had happened in the graveyard. He described the ritual that had restored Voldemort's body, the gathering of the Death Eaters, and the threat that now faced the wizarding world. Albus Dumbledore listened carefully as Harry explained everything he had witnessed. Dumbledore understood immediately that the boy's story could not be ignored. The details matched many fears that had quietly lingered since Voldemort's disappearance years earlier. Cornelius Fudge soon arrived at Hogwarts after receiving word that the tournament had ended in tragedy. As Minister for Magic, he needed to address both the death of a student and the extraordinary claims Harry Potter had begun making. Fudge listened to the account with visible unease. The idea that Voldemort had returned was almost impossible for him to accept. For more than a decade, the wizarding world had believed that the Dark Lord was gone forever. The Ministry had built its entire sense of stability on that assumption. Accepting Harry's story would mean acknowledging that the peace the wizarding world enjoyed might have been only temporary. It would also mean admitting that the Ministry had failed to detect or prevent the return of its greatest enemy. Dumbledore urged Fudge to recognize the seriousness of the situation. He argued that the wizarding government needed to prepare immediately for Voldemort's renewed activity. According to Harry's account, the Dark Lord had already begun gathering his followers once again. Fudge struggled with the implications of this claim. The return of Voldemort would cause panic across the wizarding community. Families who had lived through the war would once again fear the possibility of violence and persecution. For a leader whose political philosophy centered on maintaining stability, the idea of publicly announcing Voldemort's return was deeply troubling. Such a declaration would immediately shatter the calm the Ministry had spent years preserving. The minister therefore reacted cautiously. Instead of accepting Harry's account as fact, he began searching for alternative explanations. Perhaps the boy had been confused after witnessing Cedric's death. Perhaps the story had been exaggerated in the chaos following the tournament. Dumbledore saw this hesitation with growing concern. In his view, the evidence was already clear enough to demand immediate action. Waiting for additional proof could give Voldemort time to strengthen his position and gather supporters. Yet Fudge remained unconvinced. The idea that the Dark Lord had truly returned seemed too extraordinary to accept without undeniable confirmation. In the minister's mind, the wizarding world could not be thrown into fear based solely on the testimony of a young student, no matter how famous that student might be. As the night came to an end, the wizarding government stood at a crossroads. Harry Potter insisted that Voldemort had risen again. Dumbledore believed him and urged the Ministry to prepare for the consequences. Cornelius Fudge, however, faced a decision that would shape the course of his entire career. Accepting the truth meant acknowledging that the peace he had promised the wizarding world was about to collapse. And in that moment, standing between fear and denial, the Minister for Magic began choosing the path that would define the years ahead. The hours following the events at Hogwarts left the wizarding world standing at the edge of a question that few people were prepared to answer. Harry Potter insisted that Voldemort had returned. Albus Dumbledore believed him immediately. For Cornelius Fudge, however, accepting that claim meant confronting consequences that extended far beyond a single tragic night. Fudge had spent years leading the wizarding government during a period of apparent peace. His authority depended on the belief that the Ministry understood the state of the magical world and could protect its citizens from danger. If Voldemort had truly returned without the Ministry realizing it, that belief would collapse instantly. The minister therefore faced a decision that was both political and personal. Accepting the truth would require announcing to the wizarding world that the most feared dark wizard in history was alive again. It would mean admitting that the Ministry had been unaware of the threat until a schoolboy reported it. For a government built on the promise of stability, such an admission carried enormous risk. In the days following the tournament, Fudge began searching for explanations that would allow him to avoid that conclusion. Cedric Diggory's death was undeniable, but the circumstances surrounding it could be interpreted in several ways. The Ministry could investigate the incident as a tragic accident during a dangerous magical competition rather than evidence of a larger plot. Harry Potter's story, however detailed it might be, still came from a single witness. From the Minister's perspective, relying on that account alone seemed irresponsible. The wizarding world had lived peacefully for many years. Declaring that Voldemort had returned could trigger widespread fear and uncertainty. Fudge also found the implications of Dumbledore's certainty deeply unsettling. The headmaster of Hogwarts did not speak cautiously about the matter. He believed the Dark Lord had been restored and insisted that the wizarding government needed to begin preparing for another war. To Fudge, this urgency seemed almost reckless. Mobilizing the Ministry against a threat that might not exist would disrupt the entire structure of wizarding society. Auras would need to be reassigned, new laws might be introduced, and public anxiety would rise immediately. The minister therefore began framing the situation differently in his own mind. Rather than viewing Harry's story as a warning, he treated it as a possibility that required careful verification before any action could be taken. This approach gradually turned into denial. Fudge convinced himself that Voldemort's return was unlikely. The Dark Lord had vanished years earlier, leaving behind no body and no clear explanation for his defeat. Many witches and wizards had speculated about how he might have survived in some weakened form, but none had ever produced evidence of his recovery. For more than a decade, the wizarding world had functioned under the assumption that Voldemort was gone. Accepting Harry's claim meant abandoning that assumption overnight. Fudge began considering alternative interpretations. Perhaps someone had impersonated Voldemort during the incident in the graveyard. Perhaps Harry had misidentified the wizard responsible for Cedric's death. The minister focused on these possibilities because they preserved the idea that the larger threat no longer existed. Another factor influenced his thinking as well. Harry Potter was famous throughout the wizarding world as the boy who had survived Voldemort's attack. Over the years, his name had become associated with extraordinary events, rumors, and public fascination. Fudge wondered privately whether the boy might have misunderstood what he witnessed in the graveyard. The situation had been terrifying, and Cedric Diggory had died in front of him. Under such circumstances, memory could easily become confused. Yet the minister's doubts about Harry's account were not the only source of tension. His growing suspicion toward Dumbledore began playing a role as well. For many years, Fudge had respected the headmaster's wisdom. But now Dumbledore was asking the Ministry to take drastic action based entirely on the testimony of one student. The speed with which Dumbledore accepted Harry's story made the minister uneasy. In the political world of the Ministry, influence mattered greatly. Dumbledore already possessed enormous respect among witches and wizards. If the headmaster publicly supported the claim that Voldemort had returned, many people would believe him without question. Fudge began worrying about what that influence might mean for his own authority. If Dumbledore's voice carried more weight than the Ministry's official statements, the government's control over public perception could weaken. The minister therefore became increasingly determined to prevent panic from spreading. Rather than presenting Harry's account as fact, the Ministry began treating the story as speculation that required further investigation. Statements given to the Daily Prophet reflected this cautious approach. Reports described Cedric Diggory's death as a tragic outcome of the tournament, while avoiding any direct confirmation that Voldemort had been involved. This narrative allowed the Ministry to maintain the appearance that the wizarding world remained safe. Citizens reading the newspaper saw no immediate reason to believe that the Dark Lord had returned. Dumbledore, however, refused to accept this silence. He began quietly contacting allies and rebuilding the Order of the Phoenix, the organization that had once resisted Voldemort during the First War. In his view, waiting for the Ministry to act would only give the Dark Lord more time to rebuild his strength. Fudge interpreted these actions as evidence that Dumbledore might be attempting to challenge the authority of the government. If the headmaster organized his own network of supporters while publicly insisting that Voldemort had returned, the Ministry could appear weak or uninformed. The idea that Dumbledore might be gathering influence outside the Ministry's control deeply troubled the minister. Instead of seeing the Order as a defensive measure against dark forces, Fudge began wondering whether Dumbledore's actions carried political ambitions. This suspicion hardened the minister's resolve. Accepting the claim that Voldemort had returned would elevate Dumbledore's warnings and validate his growing influence. Rejecting the claim allowed the Ministry to maintain control over the official narrative. Thus, denial gradually became policy. Cornelius Fudge convinced himself that the wizarding world was not facing the return of Voldemort. The alternative was simply too disruptive, too frightening, and too politically dangerous to accept. In his mind, preserving stability remained the most important responsibility of leadership. If the wizarding community believed that the Dark Lord had returned, fear would spread rapidly through every town, school, and household. Better, he believed, to treat the claim as an unfortunate misunderstanding, yet history would soon reveal that refusing to acknowledge a threat does not prevent it from growing. While the Ministry attempted to preserve calm, Voldemort and his followers were already beginning the work of rebuilding their power in the shadows of the wizarding world. As the weeks passed after the Triwizard Tournament, the disagreement between Cornelius Fudge and Albus Dumbledore began to spread quietly through the wizarding world. What had started as a difference of interpretation over one tragic night gradually became a conflict over truth itself. Harry Potter continued insisting that Voldemort had returned. Dumbledore supported that claim completely. The Ministry of Magic, led by Fudge, refused to accept it. For the minister, the situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Dumbledore's reputation meant that many witches and wizards were willing to listen carefully to his warnings. If the headmaster openly declared that the Dark Lord had returned, large parts of the wizarding community might believe him, even if the Ministry denied it. Fudge therefore faced a problem that was not only about security but about authority. The government controlled law enforcement, prisons, and official investigations, yet it did not control public trust in the same way Dumbledore did. If the wizarding world began listening to Dumbledore instead of the Ministry, the government's ability to shape events could weaken. Rather than confronting this challenge through open debate, Fudge began using another tool that had long influenced wizarding society. The Daily Prophet served as the primary source of information for magical Britain. Most citizens read it every morning, trusting its reports to reflect what was truly happening in the world. The Ministry had always maintained a cooperative relationship with the newspaper. Officials often shared information with reporters, and in return, the Prophet frequently published stories that reflected the government's perspective. Under Fudge's leadership, that relationship became even more important. Articles soon began appearing that questioned Harry Potter's account of the events in the graveyard. Instead of presenting his story as a warning, the newspaper described it as a troubling claim that lacked evidence. Reporters suggested that the boy might have been confused after witnessing Cedric Diggory's death. At first, the tone of these reports remained cautious. The Prophet did not directly accuse Harry of lying, but it raised doubts about his reliability. The newspaper reminded readers that Harry had experienced extraordinary pressure and that the tragic circumstances of the tournament could have affected his memory. Over time, the coverage became more direct. Columnists began portraying Harry as a young wizard who might be seeking attention or struggling with the burden of his own fame. Stories emphasized his unusual life, his repeated involvement in dramatic events, and the possibility that he might be exaggerating what he had seen. Fudge did not publicly order these articles to be written, but the Ministry's influence over the newspaper made its position clear. When reporters asked questions about Voldemort's supposed return, government officials responded with skepticism. The Prophet reflected that skepticism in its reporting. Albus Dumbledore soon found himself included in these discussions as well. The newspaper began describing the headmaster as a brilliant but eccentric figure whose views sometimes differed from those of the ministry. Some articles hinted that Dumbledore might be encouraging Harry's story in order to strengthen his own influence within the wizarding world. For Cornelius Fudge, this shift in public narrative served an important purpose. If the wizarding population believed that Harry and Dumbledore were mistaken or unreliable, then the ministry's version of events would remain dominant. The government could continue reassuring citizens that no new war was beginning. The strategy gradually expanded into a broader campaign. The ministry began presenting Dumbledore as a respected but potentially misguided figure whose warnings were unnecessarily alarming. This approach allowed Fudge to avoid openly attacking Dumbledore while still weakening his authority. The Daily Prophet played a central role in spreading this message. Articles described Dumbledore as someone who had grown increasingly isolated from mainstream wizarding politics. Reporters suggested that his views about Voldemort might reflect personal theories rather than confirmed fact. Within the ministry, many officials supported the minister's position. After years of peace, few people wanted to believe that Voldemort had truly returned. Accepting that possibility meant preparing for another conflict that could threaten the entire wizarding community. Aurors, administrators, and government staff members continued performing their ordinary duties. The ministry investigated crimes, regulated magical creatures, and maintained secrecy from the Muggle world. To many employees, the idea that the Dark Lord had already risen again seemed distant and unlikely. Meanwhile, Harry Potter returned to Hogwarts for another school year, carrying the weight of his warning. The students around him had all read the prophet's reports. Some believed the newspaper's portrayal of events, while others quietly trusted Harry's account. The disagreement within the wizarding world slowly widened. Families discussed the issue at home, teachers debated it within staff rooms, and ministry officials argued about it in private conversations. Yet the official position of the government remained unchanged. Cornelius Fudge continued insisting that there was no evidence confirming Voldemort's return. For the minister, this campaign served not only to reassure the public, but also to defend the authority of the ministry itself. If Dumbledore's warnings proved correct, the government would appear unprepared and ineffective. By challenging those warnings early, Fudge hoped to prevent that outcome. Yet the strategy carried consequences that he did not fully recognize. By treating Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore as unreliable voices, the ministry was gradually isolating two of the individuals who understood Voldemort better than anyone else. Within Hogwarts, Dumbledore remained calm but determined. He continued preparing quietly for the possibility of war, rebuilding the network of allies that had once fought against the Dark Lord. The Order of the Phoenix began gathering once more, though its activities remained hidden from the ministry. Outside the castle, however, the official narrative continued spreading through the pages of the Daily Prophet. To the average reader, the situation seemed increasingly clear. The government insisted that Voldemort had not returned, while Harry Potter and Dumbledore appeared to be repeating a story that many considered unlikely. For Cornelius Fudge, this campaign seemed necessary to protect the stability of the wizarding world. If fear spread too quickly, the consequences could be disastrous. Maintaining calm remained his highest priority. Yet while the ministry worked to shape public opinion, events beyond its control were already unfolding in secret. Voldemort and his followers were quietly rebuilding their strength, gathering allies, and preparing for the day when their presence could no longer be hidden. And when that moment arrived, the conflict between the ministry and those who had warned of the truth would become impossible to ignore. As the Ministry of Magic continued denying Voldemort's return, Harry Potter increasingly found himself at the center of a growing controversy. For many witches and wizards, Harry had once represented hope. The boy who survived Voldemort's attack as a baby had become a symbol of the war's end. His name was spoken with admiration and curiosity throughout the wizarding world. Now that reputation was beginning to change. The Daily Prophet continued publishing articles that questioned Harry's story about the graveyard. Each report repeated the ministry's position that there was no reliable evidence proving Voldemort had returned. Instead of presenting Harry as a hero who had uncovered a terrible truth, the newspaper gradually began portraying him as someone whose claims might be exaggerated or confused. Cornelius Fudge did not publicly attack Harry directly, but the ministry's message became increasingly clear. Officials spoke about the need for careful investigation rather than emotional reaction. The implication was that Harry's story could not be trusted without independent proof. For the wizarding public, the shift in tone was unsettling. Many people remembered the celebration that followed Voldemort's disappearance years earlier. Harry had been seen as the child who had brought that victory. Now the same boy was being described as unreliable. Within Hogwarts, the situation quickly became more complicated. Students arrived for the new school year, carrying copies of the Daily Prophet that discussed Harry's claims. Some believed the ministry's explanation and began treating Harry with skepticism. Others quietly supported him, but hesitated to challenge the official narrative. The pressure on Harry grew with each passing week. Instead of being recognized as a witness to a dangerous event, he found himself treated as a source of rumor. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms, and whispers followed him through the corridors of the school. From the perspective of the ministry, however, this shift served an important purpose. If the wizarding community began doubting Harry's story, the government could preserve the sense of stability that Fudge believed was essential. The public would see the situation as a misunderstanding, rather than the beginning of another war. Cornelius Fudge continued speaking cautiously about the matter whenever reporters asked questions. He emphasized that the ministry had investigated the events surrounding the Triwizard Tournament and had found no evidence that Voldemort had returned. The minister repeated that the wizarding world should remain calm and avoid jumping to frightening conclusions. This message appeared frequently in the pages of the Daily Prophet. Articles described Harry's claims as troubling but unsupported. Some reports suggested that the boy might have been deeply affected by Cedric Diggory's death, and that grief could easily distort memory. At the same time, the newspaper began describing Harry's behavior as unusual. Stories highlighted moments when he appeared angry or frustrated, suggesting that he might be struggling emotionally. The effect of these reports was subtle but powerful. Readers began seeing Harry less as a hero and more as a troubled teenager. For Fudge, this portrayal helped maintain the ministry's authority. If Harry's claims could be dismissed as the result of confusion or emotional distress, the government would not need to acknowledge the possibility that Voldemort had returned. Yet the situation also created a new problem for the ministry. Harry Potter was not an ordinary student. His experiences had placed him at the center of several extraordinary events throughout his life. Each year at Hogwarts had brought encounters with dark magic that the ministry itself had struggled to explain. Some witches and wizards therefore hesitated to accept the prophet's portrayal completely. They remembered that Harry had uncovered the truth about the Philosopher's Stone, faced Voldemort again in the Chamber of Secrets, and survived the return of the Dark Lord's diary. These events made it difficult to dismiss his story entirely. Despite this uncertainty, the ministry continued reinforcing its position. Officials repeated that the wizarding government had no reason to believe the Dark Lord had returned. Investigations into Death Eater activity produced no immediate signs of organized movement, which Fudge used as further evidence supporting his view. Within Hogwarts, however, Harry found strong support from a small group of friends and allies. Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley believed his account without hesitation. Albus Dumbledore also remained firmly convinced that Harry had told the truth. Dumbledore's confidence frustrated the minister even further. The headmaster's influence meant that many students and teachers trusted his judgment. As long as Dumbledore publicly supported Harry, the ministry's narrative could never fully silence the boy's warning. Fudge began viewing the situation not only as a disagreement over facts, but as a challenge to the government's authority. If a student and a school headmaster could contradict the ministry without consequence, the structure of wizarding leadership might begin to weaken. The result was a subtle but persistent effort to isolate Harry from positions of influence. Ministry officials avoided direct contact with him, whenever possible. Instead of inviting him to speak about the graveyard, they allowed the Daily Prophet to shape the conversation. As the months passed, the wizarding public became divided. Some witches and wizards believed Harry's warning and quietly prepared for the possibility that Voldemort had returned. Others accepted the Ministry's reassurance and assumed that the boy's story had been exaggerated. For Cornelius Fudge, maintaining this division was preferable to admitting that the Dark Lord might already be gathering strength. As long as the government's position remained dominant, the wizarding world could continue believing that peace still existed. Yet while the Ministry questioned Harry's credibility, the forces he had warned about were already moving in secret. Voldemort's followers were regrouping, searching for allies, and preparing for the moment when their master would reveal his return openly. The boy whose warning had been dismissed stood at the center of a truth the wizarding government refused to see. And with each passing day, the gap between what the Ministry believed and what was actually happening in the shadows continued to grow wider. As the disagreement between the Ministry of Magic and Albus Dumbledore continued to grow, Cornelius Fudge began searching for a way to increase the government's influence within Hogwarts itself. The school had long operated with considerable independence under Dumbledore's leadership. While the Ministry maintained official authority over magical education, the daily operation of Hogwarts had rarely been shaped directly by government officials. Under ordinary circumstances, this arrangement caused little concern. Hogwarts had functioned successfully for centuries, and Dumbledore's reputation as headmaster inspired confidence among parents and students alike. Yet the situation had changed after Harry Potter's claims about Voldemort's return. From Fudge's perspective, the school had become a place where the Ministry's authority was being quietly challenged. Dumbledore openly supported Harry's account of the graveyard, and many students were beginning to believe the headmaster rather than the government. If that influence continued to grow, it could weaken the Ministry's control over public opinion. Fudge therefore decided that the Ministry needed a direct presence inside Hogwarts. Someone loyal to the government could observe the school's activities, report on Dumbledore's actions, and ensure that the Ministry's policies were respected. The person chosen for this task was Dolores Umbridge. Umbridge already worked within the Ministry as a senior official. She served as Undersecretary to the Minister, a position that placed her close to the center of wizarding politics. Her loyalty to Cornelius Fudge was well known, and she had built a reputation as someone who strongly supported the authority of the government. Her personality also made her particularly suited to the role the minister had in mind. Umbridge believed deeply in rules, regulations, and the importance of maintaining order through strict administration. She viewed the Ministry as the ultimate authority in the wizarding world and rarely questioned its decisions. When Fudge appointed her to Hogwarts, the official explanation presented to the public was relatively simple. The Ministry would send a representative to evaluate the quality of magical education at the school. According to the government, this review would ensure that Hogwarts continued meeting the standards expected by the wizarding community. The announcement appeared reasonable to many citizens. After all, the Ministry was responsible for overseeing magical education. Conducting inspections at the country's primary school seemed like a normal administrative decision, yet the true purpose of Umbridge's presence went beyond routine evaluation. Fudge wanted someone inside the school who could monitor Dumbledore's influence and prevent the spread of ideas that contradicted the Ministry's position. When Umbridge arrived at Hogwarts, she immediately began establishing her authority. Her first task involved observing the teaching practices of the professors. She attended lessons, took careful notes, and evaluated whether instructors followed Ministry guidelines. Many of the teachers found these inspections uncomfortable. Hogwarts had always allowed its staff considerable freedom in designing their lessons. Now, an official from the Ministry sat quietly at the back of classrooms, watching every detail of their instruction. Students also noticed the change in atmosphere. The presence of a government official created a sense that the school was no longer entirely separate from the political conflicts outside its walls. Rumors quickly spread that Umbridge had been sent specifically to monitor Dumbledore. For Cornelius Fudge, however, the arrangement seemed entirely appropriate. If Hogwarts had become a place where the Ministry's authority was being questioned, it was only reasonable for the government to observe what was happening there. Umbridge soon received an additional responsibility as well. She was appointed to teach the Defense Against the Dark Arts class, replacing the previous instructor. This position gave her direct influence over the education of Hogwarts students. Her approach to teaching reflected the Ministry's broader position regarding Voldemort's supposed return. Instead of instructing students in practical defensive magic, Umbridge emphasized theoretical study. Her lessons focused on reading approved Ministry textbooks rather than practicing spells. When students asked why they were not learning defensive techniques, Umbridge responded that there was no immediate danger requiring such training. The Ministry's official position was that the wizarding world remained safe. Teaching students to expect dark wizards around every corner, she argued, would only encourage unnecessary fear. This philosophy aligned perfectly with Cornelius Fudge's political strategy. If the government insisted that Voldemort had not returned, then preparing students to defend themselves against dark magic might suggest that the threat was real. Within the classroom, however, the results were frustrating for many students. Some of them, including Harry Potter, had already encountered dangerous magic during previous years at Hogwarts. They understood that theoretical knowledge alone would not protect them if another conflict truly began. Tension gradually grew between Umbridge and the students who questioned her methods. Harry in particular became a focus of her attention. His public insistence that Voldemort had returned directly contradicted the Ministry's narrative. For Umbridge, maintaining the authority of the government within Hogwarts became her highest priority. She frequently reminded students that the Ministry of Magic existed to guide the wizarding world and that its decisions should not be questioned lightly. Through her actions, the influence of the Ministry within the school began expanding steadily. What had started as a simple inspection soon developed into something far more significant. From his office in the Ministry of Magic, Cornelius Fudge followed these developments with satisfaction. Placing a loyal official inside Hogwarts allowed the government to observe events more closely than before. If Dumbledore attempted to challenge the Ministry's authority, the government would now know immediately. Yet the minister did not fully understand the consequences of this decision. By sending Dolores Umbridge into the school with the authority of the Ministry behind her, he had introduced a force that would transform the daily life of Hogwarts students. What began as a political strategy to maintain control over a narrative was quietly becoming one of the most controversial decisions of Fudge's entire administration. When Dolores Umbridge first arrived at Hogwarts, her role appeared limited to observation and instruction. She attended classes, evaluated teachers, and quietly reported her findings to the Ministry of Magic. For Cornelius Fudge, this arrangement offered reassurance. The government now had someone inside the school who could monitor events closely and ensure that Dumbledore's influence did not challenge the Ministry's authority. Yet Umbridge's presence soon began expanding beyond the original purpose of inspection. The Ministry gradually introduced a series of new regulations that allowed its representative to exercise increasing control over the school. These rules came in the form of educational decrees. Each decree announced a new policy approved by the Ministry of Magic, and each one shifted authority away from Hogwarts itself. At first, the changes seemed minor. New regulations established standards for student organizations and limited the ways teachers could discuss certain subjects. The Ministry explained that these policies were necessary to ensure proper discipline and accurate instruction. Behind these decisions, however, lay the same concern that had shaped Fudge's earlier actions. Hogwarts had become a place where the Ministry's narrative about Voldemort was openly questioned. If the school continued allowing that discussion, the government's position might appear weak. By introducing educational decrees, the Ministry attempted to control what students learned and what teachers could say within the classroom. Dolores Umbridge enforced these regulations with enthusiasm. She believed deeply in the importance of order and obedience, and the decrees gave her the authority to reshape Hogwarts according to ministry policy. One decree restricted teachers from discussing topics that were not directly related to their official curriculum. This rule was particularly significant for the defense against the dark arts class. Under Umbridge's instruction, students were expected to study theoretical material rather than practice defensive magic. The reason for this approach was simple. If the ministry insisted that Voldemort had not returned, teaching students how to defend themselves against dark wizards might suggest that danger existed. Another decree placed strict limits on student organizations. Clubs and societies could no longer meet without direct approval from the ministry representative. The regulation appeared administrative on the surface, but its purpose was clear. The government wanted to prevent students from gathering in ways that might encourage discussion about Voldemort's return. With each new decree, Umbridge's authority inside the school grew stronger. She could now observe teachers, control student activities, and influence how subjects were taught. The independence Hogwarts had enjoyed for centuries began gradually shrinking. Cornelius Fudge followed these developments with approval. From his perspective, the ministry was simply ensuring that Hogwarts operated responsibly. If the school had become a place where rumors about Voldemort spread freely, then stronger oversight was necessary. To the students living inside the castle, however, the atmosphere began changing noticeably. The corridors that once echoed with casual conversations about lessons and Quidditch matches now carried an undercurrent of tension. Notices announcing new educational decrees appeared regularly on the walls. Each new regulation reminded students that the ministry was watching closely. Teachers also felt the pressure. Some professors attempted to continue their lessons as usual, while carefully avoiding subjects that might attract Umbridge's attention. Others quietly expressed concern about the growing influence of the ministry within the school. For Albus Dumbledore, the situation created a difficult challenge. As headmaster, he remained responsible for protecting the students and preserving the traditions of Hogwarts. Yet openly confronting the ministry could create further conflict that might endanger the school itself. Dumbledore therefore responded cautiously. He allowed the ministry's decrees to be posted and enforced, while quietly maintaining as much independence as possible within the remaining boundaries. Umbridge interpreted this restraint as confirmation that her authority was expanding successfully. With the backing of the ministry behind her, she continued introducing new rules that strengthened her position. Eventually, the educational decrees reached a point where Umbridge gained the power to remove teachers from their positions if she judged their performance unsatisfactory. This authority placed the future of Hogwarts staff members directly under the control of the ministry. For many observers within the wizarding world, these developments remained largely invisible. Newspapers continued focusing on the ministry's message that Voldemort had not returned. The situation inside Hogwarts was rarely discussed in public reports. Yet within the school itself, the changes felt significant. Students who had grown up hearing about Hogwarts as a place of freedom and magical exploration now found themselves living under a system of strict oversight. Cornelius Fudge believed these measures were necessary to maintain stability. If the wizarding government allowed rumors about Voldemort to spread unchecked, fear could return to the community that had worked so hard to rebuild after the war. By strengthening the ministry's authority inside Hogwarts, Fudge hoped to prevent those fears from taking root. What he did not fully understand was that the effort to silence discussion about Voldemort's return was already creating a new kind of resistance. Among the students who believed Harry Potter's story, the growing control of the ministry only reinforced their suspicion that the government was hiding the truth. As the educational decrees continued reshaping life within the castle, Hogwarts slowly became more than just a school caught in a political dispute. It was turning into the center of a quiet struggle between the authority of the Ministry of Magic and the growing belief among students that the danger Harry had described was real. As the ministry's authority expanded within Hogwarts, many students began feeling that something essential about their school was changing. The corridors were still filled with lessons, conversations, and the ordinary routines of magical education, but the atmosphere had grown more cautious. Notices announcing new educational decrees appeared frequently, and the presence of Dolores Umbridge reminded everyone that the Ministry of Magic was watching closely. For Cornelius Fudge, this new structure represented a necessary step. The wizarding government had decided that Hogwarts could no longer remain completely independent, while the question of Voldemort's return continued dividing public opinion. By strengthening oversight within the school, the ministry hoped to prevent rumors and fears from spreading further. Yet the effect on the students was not what the ministry expected. Many of them had listened carefully to Harry Potter's account of the events in the graveyard. They had also seen the changes in the defense against the dark arts classroom, where practical instruction had been replaced with quiet reading from approved ministry texts. For students who believed Harry's warning, this approach seemed dangerously inadequate. If Voldemort truly had returned, theoretical knowledge would not be enough to protect anyone. This concern began quietly among small groups of friends who discussed the situation away from Umbridge's attention. Conversations that started in common rooms or between classes slowly turned into something more organized. Students who believed Harry's story began wondering whether they could prepare themselves without the ministry's approval. Hermione Granger played an important role in shaping this idea. She recognized that the students were already learning many defensive spells in other classes, and that Harry himself had faced situations involving dark magic far beyond the experience of most young witches and wizards. If the school would not teach them how to defend themselves properly, perhaps they could learn together. The plan was simple but bold. Interested students would meet privately and practice defensive magic under Harry's guidance. These meetings would take place away from the notice of the ministry's representative. By working together, they could prepare themselves for dangers the ministry insisted did not exist. The group eventually became known as Dumbledore's Army. The name itself reflected a quiet challenge to the ministry's narrative. By associating the group with Albus Dumbledore, the students signaled their trust in the headmaster's belief that Voldemort had returned. It also reminded them that the wizarding world had once relied on Dumbledore's leadership during the First War. Meetings took place in a hidden room within the castle, known as the Room of Requirement. The magical chamber could appear whenever someone truly needed it, making it an ideal place for secret gatherings. During these meetings, Harry taught the other students spells that could protect them against dark magic. They practiced defensive charms, shielding techniques, and spells designed to disarm opponents. Many of the students had never attempted such magic before, but they quickly discovered that learning together made the lessons more effective. The group included witches and wizards from different houses: Gryffindors, Hufflepuffs, Ravenclaws, and even a few Slytherins joined the meetings. Despite the rivalries that often divided the houses, the shared concern about the future of the wizarding world brought them together. For the students involved, these gatherings created a sense of purpose that the official curriculum could not provide. They were no longer simply reading about defensive theory. They were preparing themselves for the possibility that the peace around them might not last. Outside the Room of Requirement, however, the ministry remained unaware of these activities. Dolores Umbridge continued enforcing educational decrees and observing the teachers. She believed the regulations were successfully restoring order within the school. Cornelius Fudge also believed the situation at Hogwarts was under control. Reports from Umbridge described the enforcement of new rules and the gradual strengthening of ministry authority. From the minister's perspective, the government's presence within the school was working as intended. Yet beneath that appearance of control, a new generation of witches and wizards was quietly learning skills that the ministry had chosen not to teach. The existence of Dumbledore's army represented something more than a secret club. It was evidence that many students no longer trusted the official explanation coming from the ministry. Instead, they chose to prepare themselves for a future that the government refused to acknowledge. For Harry Potter, leading these meetings carried a responsibility he had never expected. He had spent much of the year defending his story against doubt and criticism. Now he found himself teaching others how to face the dangers he believed were coming. As the weeks passed, the students of Dumbledore's army grew more confident in their abilities. They practiced spells that could repel curses, shield against attacks, and summon protective magic. Each successful lesson reinforced their belief that preparation was necessary. Within the Ministry, however, none of this was visible. Cornelius Fudge continued focusing on preserving stability in the wizarding world. The government maintained its position that Voldemort had not returned, and the Daily Prophet continued publishing articles that supported that narrative. From the minister's perspective, the greatest threat to order remained the spread of fear. If the wizarding community began believing that another war was approaching, panic could disrupt every aspect of magical society. What Fudge could not see was that the refusal to acknowledge danger had already created its own form of resistance. Inside Hogwarts, students were quietly preparing themselves for a conflict that the Ministry insisted did not exist. And with each secret meeting of Dumbledore's army, the divide between the government's version of reality and the growing belief among young witches and wizards became even more difficult to ignore. For much of Cornelius Fudge's time as Minister for Magic, the authority of the Ministry had rested on a simple foundation. The wizarding government presented itself as the guardian of order and stability. Laws were enforced, magical secrecy was maintained, and the public trusted that the Ministry understood the dangers facing their world. After the events of the Triwizard Tournament, that confidence slowly began to weaken. At first, the changes were subtle. The Ministry continued repeating its position that Voldemort had not returned, and the Daily Prophet continued publishing articles that supported the government's view. Yet beneath the surface, reports of strange and troubling events began appearing across the wizarding world. Some of these incidents were difficult to explain. Wizards reported sightings of dark figures moving through forests late at night. Magical creatures behaved in unusual ways, abandoning territories they had occupied for years. A few isolated attacks on witches and wizards occurred under mysterious circumstances. Individually, these events did not seem connected. Each one could be explained as a separate problem handled by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Yet taken together, they created a quiet sense of unease that spread through magical communities. Cornelius Fudge received regular reports from Ministry officials investigating these incidents. In most cases, the explanations remained uncertain. Without clear evidence linking the events to a larger threat, the Ministry treated them as isolated disturbances rather than signs of organized activity. From the minister's perspective, maintaining calm remained the most important responsibility. The wizarding world had spent more than a decade rebuilding after the first war against Voldemort. Allowing rumors of dark activity to spread unchecked could undo that fragile sense of security. The Ministry therefore continued presenting each incident as an individual case. When reports reached the Daily Prophet, they were described as minor disturbances, quickly resolved by auras or local authorities. The government emphasized that there was no evidence of coordinated attacks. Yet among the public, questions began quietly circulating. Some witches and wizards remembered the early years of Voldemort's rise, when isolated incidents had gradually grown into a wider campaign of terror. The similarities were difficult for older members of the community to ignore. Inside Hogwarts, the students of Dumbledore's army watched these developments with particular attention. Many of them had already concluded that Harry Potter's warning about Voldemort was true. When news of unusual events reached the castle, it only strengthened their belief that something dangerous was unfolding beyond the Ministry's control. Albus Dumbledore also recognized the pattern forming within these reports. Although the evidence remained scattered, the events suggested that dark forces might be organizing once again. The headmaster understood that Voldemort's followers would not reveal themselves openly until they were ready. For Cornelius Fudge, however, accepting that interpretation meant confronting the possibility that his government had been wrong. For months, the Ministry had insisted that Voldemort had not returned. Changing that position would force the government to admit that it had misunderstood the situation. Such an admission carried serious consequences. If the wizarding public lost confidence in the ministry's judgment, the authority of the government itself might weaken. Citizens might begin turning to other figures for leadership, including Dumbledore. The minister therefore remained cautious. Each new report of strange activity was examined carefully, but none of them provided the clear proof that would justify announcing the return of the Dark Lord. Meanwhile, tension within Hogwarts continued increasing. Dolores Umbridge's authority had expanded through a series of educational decrees, and her presence reminded students constantly that the ministry rejected Harry's claims. The divide between the government's narrative and the beliefs of many students grew wider with each passing week. Outside the castle, ordinary witches and wizards began noticing small changes in daily life. Shop owners spoke quietly about unusual customers, asking suspicious questions. Travelers reported seeing unfamiliar figures moving through remote areas of the countryside. These stories rarely appeared in the Daily Prophet, but they spread through conversation and rumor. The wizarding world had once experienced this slow rise of uncertainty before. During the early days of Voldemort's first campaign, strange incidents had appeared gradually before the full danger became visible. Some older witches and wizards recognized the pattern and felt a quiet sense of dread returning. Yet without official confirmation from the ministry, these fears remained only speculation. The government continued insisting that there was no organized threat facing the wizarding community. Cornelius Fudge believed that maintaining this position protected the stability of the magical world. As long as the ministry avoided spreading alarm, everyday life could continue without disruption. But the longer the ministry denied the possibility of Voldemort's return, the more the gap between official statements and private suspicion widened. Each unexplained event added another small crack to the foundation of trust that had supported the government for so many years. By the time those cracks became impossible to ignore, the wizarding world would discover that the danger Harry Potter had described was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was already beginning to move openly. For many months, the wizarding world existed in a state of uneasy balance. The Ministry of Magic continued insisting that Voldemort had not returned, while Albus Dumbledore and Harry Potter maintained the opposite claim. Reports of strange activity circulated quietly among witches and wizards, yet none of these incidents had forced the government to change its official position. Cornelius Fudge remained determined to preserve stability. As long as the ministry could present events as isolated disturbances, the wider public would continue believing that peace remained intact. The minister saw his role as preventing panic rather than encouraging fear. This fragile balance began to break during a night that would later become one of the most important moments in the history of the Second Wizarding War. Deep within the ministry building lay a mysterious division known as the Department of Mysteries. Few people understood the full nature of the work conducted there. The Unspeakables, who served in the department, studied forces that even experienced witches and wizards rarely discussed openly. Time, prophecy, thought, and death were all subjects explored within the quiet chambers of that underground wing. One of the most significant objects stored in the Department of Mysteries was a vast collection of magical prophecies. These small glass spheres contained recorded predictions made by witches and wizards with the rare ability to foresee future events. Each prophecy rested on shelves that stretched across a dimly lit hall, carefully preserved by the ministry. Among these prophecies was one that concerned Voldemort himself. Years earlier, a prophecy had been made predicting that a child born at the end of July would possess the power to defeat the Dark Lord. This prophecy had shaped many of the events that led to the attack on the Potter family. Voldemort had never heard the prophecy in its entirety. Only part of it had been reported to him before his first fall. Now that he had returned to power, he sought the complete version of the prediction that might reveal the secret of his defeat. The prophecy could only be safely removed from its shelf by the person to whom it referred. Voldemort therefore needed Harry Potter to retrieve it. To accomplish this, he planted a vision within Harry's mind. During the night, Harry saw what appeared to be a terrible scene inside the Department of Mysteries. In the vision, his godfather, Sirius Black, seemed to be held prisoner and tortured within the Ministry building. Believing the vision to be real, Harry gathered several friends and traveled to the Ministry in an attempt to rescue Sirius. Their journey led them deep into the Department of Mysteries, where they entered the Silent Hall of Prophecies. The moment Harry touched the prophecy sphere, the trap was revealed. Death Eaters appeared within the chamber, surrounding the group of students. Voldemort's followers had been waiting for Harry to retrieve the prophecy for them. Their goal was to take the object and deliver it to their master. The confrontation that followed turned the quiet hall into a battlefield. Harry and his friends attempted to escape while the Death Eaters pursued them through the corridors of the Department of Mysteries. Spells flashed through the darkness as the young witches and wizards fought to defend themselves. The struggle quickly drew the attention of members of the Order of the Phoenix. Albus Dumbledore had suspected that Voldemort might attempt to lure Harry into the Ministry. When the danger became clear, several members of the Order rushed to the Department of Mysteries to protect the students. A fierce battle erupted between the Death Eaters and the members of the Order. Magical spells echoed through the underground chambers as both sides fought across the different rooms of the department. Shelves collapsed, magical objects shattered, and the quiet halls of research turned into scenes of chaos. During the conflict, the prophecy sphere was destroyed, eliminating the object Voldemort had hoped to obtain. But the fighting continued as both sides attempted to gain control of the situation. Eventually, the confrontation reached the atrium of the Ministry itself. By this time, the disturbance had drawn the attention of Ministry officials working late in the building. Among those who responded to the alarm was Cornelius Fudge. The minister arrived expecting to discover some kind of disturbance within the Department of Mysteries. What he found instead was a scene that forced him to confront a truth he had spent months refusing to accept. Standing in the atrium, surrounded by shattered fountains and the echoes of magical combat, Fudge saw Voldemort with his own eyes. The Dark Lord had appeared inside the Ministry building, drawn there by the battle between his followers and the Order of the Phoenix. The moment lasted only seconds before Voldemort vanished to avoid capture, but it was long enough for the minister to recognize him clearly. For the first time since the night of the Triwizard Tournament, Cornelius Fudge faced undeniable proof that Harry Potter had been telling the truth. The figure standing before him was not a rumor, not a misunderstanding, and not an exaggeration. The most feared dark wizard in history had returned. The implications of that realization were immediate and overwhelming. The Ministry of Magic had spent months denying the possibility of Voldemort's return. Newspapers had questioned Harry Potter's credibility, and government officials had dismissed Dumbledore's warnings. Now the minister himself had witnessed the truth. Around him, auras and Ministry officials struggled to contain the chaos left behind by the battle. Several Death Eaters had been captured during the fighting, and members of the Order of the Phoenix stood alongside the students who had been drawn into the conflict. For Cornelius Fudge, the moment marked the collapse of the narrative his administration had defended for so long. The Dark Lord had returned, and the wizarding government had not recognized the danger until it appeared inside its own headquarters. In the days that followed, the wizarding world would learn that the peace it had trusted for more than a decade had already ended. The moment Cornelius Fudge saw Voldemort inside the Ministry atrium, the position he had defended for months collapsed instantly. Until that night, the minister had insisted that Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore were mistaken. The government had repeated that claim through official statements and through the pages of the Daily Prophet. Yet the figure Fudge witnessed in the Ministry left no room for doubt. Voldemort had returned. The Dark Lord vanished before the auras could capture him, but the brief encounter was enough. Several Ministry officials had seen him clearly, and members of the Order of the Phoenix confirmed his identity without hesitation. The evidence that had once seemed uncertain now stood directly in front of the wizarding government. For Cornelius Fudge, the realization carried immediate consequences. The policy he had followed since the Triwizard Tournament could no longer continue. Denying Voldemort's return had been possible when the evidence was unclear, but it was impossible after the Dark Lord had appeared inside the Ministry itself. The following morning, the Wizarding world began receiving the news that the government had resisted for nearly a year. The Ministry of Magic officially acknowledged that Lord Voldemort had returned. This announcement marked one of the most dramatic reversals of policy in the history of the Wizarding government. Only weeks earlier, the Ministry had dismissed Harry Potter's warnings and questioned the judgment of Albus Dumbledore. Now those same warnings were recognized as accurate. The Daily Prophet changed its tone almost immediately. Articles that had once portrayed Harry as unreliable now described him as the first witness to Voldemort's return. The newspaper explained that new evidence had confirmed the truth of his account and that the Ministry had acted quickly once the situation became clear. To many readers, this sudden shift was confusing. Some witches and wizards accepted the explanation without question. Others remembered the earlier reports that had criticized Harry and Dumbledore and began wondering why the Ministry had resisted the truth for so long. Cornelius Fudge faced the difficult task of addressing the Wizarding community after months of denial. As minister, he was responsible for preparing the country to face the danger that had now been confirmed. The government began organizing defensive measures immediately. Auras were assigned to investigate suspected Death Eater activity. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement expanded its efforts to track dark magic throughout the country. Protective enchantments around important locations were strengthened. At the same time, the Ministry worked to reassure the public that the situation remained under control. Official statements emphasized that the Wizarding government was prepared to defend the community and that steps were already being taken to confront the threat. For many witches and wizards, however, the return of Voldemort reopened memories that had never fully disappeared. The First Wizarding War had left deep scars across magical Britain. Families remembered relatives who had been lost, homes that had been destroyed, and years of fear that had touched nearly every part of society. The knowledge that the Dark Lord had returned brought those memories back with unsettling clarity. Within Hogwarts, the news also transformed the atmosphere of the school. Students who had supported Harry Potter throughout the previous year felt a sense of quiet vindication. The warning they had believed was now accepted as fact. At the same time, the conflict between the Ministry and Hogwarts could no longer continue in the same way. Dolores Umbridge's position within the school had depended on the government's denial of Voldemort's return. With that denial now gone, the policies she had enforced no longer reflected the Ministry's priorities. The need for practical preparation against dark magic had become undeniable. Albus Dumbledore's role in the Wizarding world also changed immediately. For months, he had been treated as a controversial figure whose warnings challenged the government. Now those warnings had proven correct. Many witches and wizards once again looked to him for guidance in the uncertain days ahead. Cornelius Fudge recognized this shift clearly. The headmaster of Hogwarts had been right about the most important threat facing the Wizarding world. That realization weakened the minister's position in ways that could not easily be repaired. The government had spent months attempting to protect public stability by denying Voldemort's return. Yet that decision had also damaged the ministry's credibility once the truth became visible. Despite these difficulties, the Wizarding world now faced a challenge far greater than political disagreement. Voldemort had returned openly, and his followers were already moving through the shadows of magical society. The question that remained was no longer whether the Dark Lord had risen again. It was whether the Wizarding government that had once denied his return could now lead the fight against him. In the days that followed the battle within the Ministry, the Wizarding world experienced a sudden shift in its understanding of recent events. For months, the government had insisted that Voldemort had not returned. Now the Ministry itself confirmed that the Dark Lord had appeared inside its own headquarters. The announcement spread quickly across magical Britain. The Daily Prophet published a new series of articles explaining that Lord Voldemort had indeed returned and that the Ministry of Magic was preparing for the possibility of renewed conflict. Reports described the battle that had taken place within the Department of Mysteries, and the capture of several Death Eaters who had fought alongside their master. For many witches and wizards, the news produced a mixture of shock and uneasy recognition. The strange reports that had circulated quietly during the previous months now seemed connected to a larger threat. Families who had lived through the First Wizarding War felt an immediate sense of concern. They remembered how quickly Voldemort's influence had once spread across the magical world. Attacks had begun slowly before growing into a conflict that touched nearly every community. Younger witches and wizards experienced the news differently. Many of them had grown up hearing stories about Voldemort, but had never expected to see his return in their own lifetime. The idea that another war might begin felt distant and unfamiliar. Within the Ministry itself, the atmosphere became tense and urgent. Departments that had once focused on routine administration now turned their attention towards security and investigation. Aurors worked long hours, following leads about possible Death Eater activity. Cornelius Fudge remained in his position as minister, but the authority he had once exercised with confidence now faced growing scrutiny. Many members of the wizarding community remembered how strongly the government had denied Voldemort's return. Questions began quietly circulating among both citizens and officials. Some people wondered whether the ministry had ignored warning signs that might have revealed the truth earlier. Others asked whether the government had placed too much effort into protecting public calm instead of preparing for the danger that was now confirmed. Fudge understood these concerns, though he rarely addressed them directly in public statements. As minister, he continued emphasizing the need for unity among witches and wizards during the uncertain period ahead. The ministry, therefore, focused on presenting a message of readiness. Officials explained that new protective measures were being organized and that the government would cooperate closely with Aurors and other magical authorities to monitor dark activity. Despite these assurances, the political situation within the ministry grew increasingly complicated. Some members of the Wizengamot and senior ministry staff began questioning whether Fudge's leadership remained effective. The months of denial had allowed Voldemort time to rebuild his network of followers. Critics argued that the wizarding government might now be facing a stronger enemy than it would have if the threat had been acknowledged earlier. These discussions remained largely private, but their influence gradually spread through the ministry's corridors. At Hogwarts, the confirmation of Voldemort's return changed the relationship between the school and the government as well. The policies introduced by Dolores Umbridge during the previous year had been built upon the ministry's belief that no immediate danger existed. Now that belief could no longer be defended. The presence of a ministry official restricting defensive instruction seemed increasingly inappropriate when the wizarding world had officially entered a new period of conflict. Students and teachers alike recognized that practical preparation would be necessary. Albus Dumbledore resumed a more visible role in guiding the school's response to the changing situation. As someone who had already accepted Voldemort's return, he had quietly begun preparing for the possibility of renewed war months earlier. Members of the Order of the Phoenix also expanded their activities once again. The organization, which had originally formed during the First Wizarding War, now worked to gather information about Voldemort's followers and protect vulnerable members of the magical community. Cornelius Fudge was aware of these efforts, though his relationship with Dumbledore remained complicated. The headmaster's warnings had proven correct, and many witches and wizards now viewed him as one of the most reliable voices during the growing crisis. Meanwhile, the captured Death Eaters from the battle at the Department of Mysteries were transferred to Azkaban prison. Their arrests provided the ministry with important information about the network of followers Voldemort had begun rebuilding. Yet even these successes carried a reminder of the government's earlier misjudgment. The captured wizards confirmed that Voldemort had returned months before the ministry officially recognized it. For Cornelius Fudge, the weight of these developments became increasingly difficult to ignore. The wizarding world now faced a threat that required clear leadership and decisive action. But the minister who had spent months denying the danger, was now expected to organize the response against it. Across magical Britain, witches and wizards waited to see how the ministry would guide them through the uncertain period ahead. What they did not yet know was that the question of leadership inside the wizarding government was already beginning to change. The weeks following the ministry's public acknowledgement of Voldemort's return brought a quiet but unmistakable change to the political atmosphere within magical Britain. While the wizarding community focused on preparing for the growing threat of dark activity, discussions about the leadership of the Ministry of Magic began taking place behind closed doors. Cornelius Fudge remained the official Minister for Magic, and in public statements, he continued emphasizing the importance of unity and vigilance. The government organized additional security measures, expanded Auror patrols, and worked to reassure the wizarding public that the situation was being managed carefully. Yet, within the ministry itself, confidence in Fudge's leadership had begun to weaken. Many senior officials remembered how strongly the government had resisted the warnings from Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore. For nearly a year, the ministry had treated those warnings as unreliable claims rather than serious evidence. Now that Voldemort's return had been confirmed, that earlier position appeared increasingly difficult to defend. Some members of the Wizengamot quietly questioned whether the government could effectively lead the fight against the Dark Lord under the same leadership that had dismissed the threat for so long. These concerns did not immediately become public debate. The wizarding world was entering a dangerous period, and few officials wanted to create additional instability by openly criticizing the ministry. However, conversations about the future of the government continued spreading through offices and committee chambers. Within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Aurors, who had spent years tracking dark wizards, felt the pressure of the new conflict. Many of them believed that the ministry should have acted sooner when the first reports of suspicious activity appeared. Although they continued performing their duties with dedication, their private discussions often returned to the same question. Could the government regain the confidence it had lost? Cornelius Fudge sensed this shift in attitude, even if it was rarely expressed directly to him. As minister, he attended meetings with department heads and advisors who reported on the progress of the ministry's response to Voldemort's return. Yet the atmosphere during these meetings had grown noticeably more cautious. Officials who once supported the minister without hesitation now spoke more carefully. Their reports focused on practical details, and their conversations rarely included the easy confidence that had once characterized the ministry's leadership. Outside the government, similar questions began appearing in quiet conversations among witches and wizards across the country. Shopkeepers, school teachers, and ministry workers alike remembered the months when Harry Potter's warnings had been dismissed. Now that those warnings had proven correct, people wondered how the government would regain the trust it had lost. The Daily Prophet continued publishing updates about the ministry's efforts to combat Death Eater activity. Articles described increased security patrols and investigations carried out by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The newspaper also emphasized that the government was cooperating with experienced witches and wizards across the magical community. Yet even the tone of these reports suggested that the political situation was changing. Journalists began writing more openly about the earlier disagreement between the ministry and Albus Dumbledore. While the Prophet avoided direct criticism of Cornelius Fudge, its articles acknowledged that the headmaster of Hogwarts had recognized Voldemort's return long before the government accepted the evidence. This acknowledgement shifted public perception in subtle ways. Dumbledore's reputation as one of the most respected figures in the wizarding world grew even stronger, while the ministry's earlier position appeared increasingly uncertain. Within Hogwarts, students and teachers watched these developments with quiet attention. The confirmation of Voldemort's return had already changed the atmosphere within the school. Now, the growing political tension within the ministry suggested that further changes might be coming. Members of the Order of the Phoenix continued gathering information about Voldemort's activities. Their work remained largely hidden from the wider public, but the organization's network of allies provided valuable insight into the movements of Death Eaters across magical Britain. These reports made one fact increasingly clear. Voldemort was not waiting for the wizarding government to resolve its political questions. While the ministry debated its leadership and organized defensive measures, the Dark Lord's followers continued rebuilding their influence in secret. For Cornelius Fudge, this reality created a difficult situation. The minister had always believed that stability within the wizarding government was essential for protecting the community. Yet the government itself was now experiencing uncertainty about its future direction. The responsibility of responding to Voldemort's return remained enormous. The ministry needed strong leadership, capable of organizing auras, protecting magical communities, and coordinating with organizations like the Order of the Phoenix. As the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that many within the ministry believed a new leader might be needed to guide that effort. The question of who would lead the wizarding government through the coming conflict had not yet been answered. But the discussions that had begun quietly within the ministry's offices suggested that Cornelius Fudge's time as Minister for Magic was approaching its end. As the wizarding world adjusted to the confirmed return of Voldemort, pressure within the Ministry of Magic continued building steadily. The government had begun organizing defensive measures, but the political consequences of the previous year's decisions had not disappeared. Instead, they quietly shaped conversations taking place throughout the ministry's corridors and meeting chambers. Cornelius Fudge still held the office of Minister for Magic, and he continued fulfilling the responsibilities of his position. He attended briefings from auras investigating Death Eater activity, reviewed reports from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and issued public statements encouraging unity among witches and wizards. Yet the confidence that had once surrounded his leadership had noticeably weakened. Senior officials within the ministry increasingly discussed the need for leadership that could restore public trust while preparing the wizarding world for the growing conflict. Many of these conversations took place privately, but their influence gradually spread through the government's departments. The central concern was not simply the return of Voldemort. It was the fact that the ministry had spent months denying the danger before finally acknowledging it. That period of denial had allowed the Dark Lord and his followers valuable time to reorganize. For many members of the wizarding government, this raised difficult questions about how the ministry should move forward. Some believed that the most effective way to rebuild confidence was through new leadership. A minister who had not been directly involved in the earlier denial might be better positioned to unite the wizarding community and organize a coordinated response against Voldemort. Others felt sympathy for Cornelius Fudge's situation. During the months after the Triwizard Tournament, the evidence surrounding Voldemort's return had been uncertain and difficult to confirm. Maintaining public calm had seemed like a responsible choice at the time. However, the reality facing the wizarding world had changed. The battle inside the ministry had proven that Voldemort was alive and actively gathering followers. Oral reports confirmed that Death Eaters were beginning to move through magical Britain once again. The situation required leadership that could respond quickly and decisively. Within the Wizengamot, quiet discussions began about the possibility of appointing a new Minister for Magic. These conversations were handled carefully to avoid creating additional instability, but the idea of leadership change gradually gained support. Cornelius Fudge was aware that these discussions were taking place. As a long-time political figure within the wizarding government, he understood how quickly opinion could shift when confidence began to fade. Despite this awareness, Fudge continued performing his duties with determination. He met with department heads, reviewed intelligence reports, and spoke with representatives from magical communities across the country. His goal remained the same as it had always been, preserving order within the wizarding world. Yet, even as he worked to stabilize the situation, the decision about the ministry's future leadership was moving closer. The wizarding government needed someone capable of guiding its response to Voldemort's return, while rebuilding trust among witches and wizards who had grown uncertain about the ministry's judgment. The responsibility required experience, authority, and a reputation for fairness, attention gradually turned toward a figure who had spent many years serving within the ministry itself. Rufus Scrimgeour, the head of the Auror office, had earned respect throughout the wizarding community for his long career fighting dark wizards. As leader of the Aurors, he had developed extensive knowledge of magical law enforcement and the threats facing the wizarding world. Scrimgeour's reputation differed significantly from that of Cornelius Fudge. While Fudge had built his career through careful administration and political negotiation, Scrimgeour was known as a practical and determined leader who had spent years confronting dangerous situations directly. For many officials within the ministry, this difference made him an appealing candidate for the difficult period ahead. The wizarding world was no longer facing a time of quiet stability. Voldemort's return meant that the government would need to respond to attacks, investigate dark activity, and coordinate with allies across magical Britain. A minister with direct experience combating dark wizards might be better suited to lead that effort. These discussions eventually reached the point where a decision became unavoidable. Cornelius Fudge's time as Minister for Magic was approaching its conclusion. The leadership of the wizarding government would soon pass to someone who had built his career preparing for the kind of conflict that was now unfolding. The change in leadership within the Ministry of Magic did not occur suddenly, but the direction of events had become clear. As the weeks passed after Voldemort's appearance at the Ministry, confidence in Cornelius Fudge continued to weaken among many members of the wizarding government. Fudge had served as Minister for Magic for many years. During much of that time, the wizarding world had enjoyed relative peace. His administration had focused on maintaining stability, regulating magical activity, and ensuring that the community recovered from the damage caused by the First War against Voldemort. For a long time, that approach had appeared successful. Yet the return of the Dark Lord had transformed the expectations placed upon the ministry. The wizarding government was no longer simply responsible for preserving calm and order. It now faced the challenge of confronting a dangerous enemy whose influence was already spreading again. In private meetings within the ministry, senior officials discussed the need for leadership that could respond more directly to the threat of renewed war. These conversations gradually led to a decision that would reshape the structure of the wizarding government. Cornelius Fudge would step down from the position of Minister for Magic. The transition was handled carefully to avoid creating unnecessary instability. Public announcements described the change as a necessary adjustment to ensure that the ministry could respond effectively to the growing crisis. Fudge's years of service were acknowledged respectfully, and the government emphasized that the decision had been made in the best interest of the wizarding community. For Fudge himself, the moment carried both personal and political weight. He had spent much of his career working within the ministry and had eventually risen to its highest office. Leaving that position meant acknowledging that the situation facing the wizarding world required a different kind of leadership. Although the circumstances surrounding his departure were connected to the earlier denial of Voldemort's return, the official explanation focused on the need for new direction rather than assigning blame. The wizarding government then announced the appointment of a new Minister for Magic. Rufus Scrimgeour, the longtime head of the Auror office, would assume the position. Scrimgeour had built his reputation through years of service within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. As leader of the Aurors, he had spent much of his career confronting dark wizards and investigating threats to magical society. His experience made him a logical choice for a time when security had become the ministry's highest priority. Unlike Fudge, whose leadership style emphasized careful political management, Scrimgeour was known for his direct approach to difficult problems. He possessed a reputation for determination and practical decision-making, qualities that many officials believed were necessary for confronting Voldemort's growing influence. When the announcement reached the wizarding public, reactions were mixed but generally accepting. Some witches and wizards felt sympathy for Cornelius Fudge. They remembered that he had served as minister during years when the wizarding world had seemed relatively peaceful. His efforts to preserve stability had reflected a sincere desire to protect the community from fear and disruption. Others believed the change in leadership was necessary. The government now faced a dangerous and uncertain period, and they hoped that new leadership would strengthen the ministry's ability to respond to the Dark Lord's return. For Cornelius Fudge, the transition marked the end of a long chapter in his life. After stepping down as minister, he withdrew from the center of wizarding politics. Although he remained a respected figure within the magical community, his direct influence over government decisions had come to an end. Meanwhile, Rufus Scrimgeour began reorganizing the ministry's response to the growing threat posed by Voldemort and his followers. The Auror office expanded its operations, security measures increased across magical Britain, and the government worked to gather intelligence about Death Eater activity. The change in leadership also influenced the relationship between the ministry and figures like Albus Dumbledore. Scrimgeour recognized that cooperation with experienced allies would be essential if the wizarding world hoped to confront the Dark Lord successfully. For the wizarding public, the transition from Fudge to Scrimgeour symbolized a broader shift in the ministry's priorities. The government was no longer focused primarily on maintaining the appearance of stability. It was now preparing openly for a conflict that could shape the future of magical society. Cornelius Fudge's time as minister had been defined by his desire to protect the wizarding world from fear. In the end, however, the return of Voldemort forced the government to confront a reality that could not be managed through reassurance alone. The leadership of the ministry had changed because the world itself had changed. After leaving the office of Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge gradually disappeared from the center of wizarding politics. For many years, he had been one of the most visible figures in magical Britain. His decisions, speeches, and policies had shaped how the Ministry of Magic interacted with the wider community. Now that responsibility belonged to someone else. Rufus Scrimgeour assumed leadership of the ministry during a time that demanded a very different style of governance. His background as head of the Auror office meant that he approached problems with the mindset of a law enforcement officer rather than a political administrator. The ministry began focusing more directly on security, intelligence gathering, and defense against dark magic. Under Scrimgeour's leadership, Auror patrols increased throughout magical Britain. Investigations into suspected Death Eater activity became more aggressive, and the ministry devoted more resources to tracking Voldemort's followers. The government openly acknowledged that the wizarding world had entered a dangerous period. For Cornelius Fudge, watching these developments from outside the ministry must have been a complex experience. The policies now being implemented were designed to confront the threat he had once believed was not yet real. Although the Dark Lord's return had eventually become undeniable, the months of uncertainty before that moment had shaped the course of Fudge's career. Historians of the wizarding world later examined this period with careful attention. Many of them observed that Fudge's leadership had been defined by his strong desire to protect stability. After the chaos of the First Wizarding War, he believed that maintaining calm and public confidence was the ministry's most important responsibility. This belief influenced many of his decisions. When Harry Potter first reported Voldemort's return after the Triwizard Tournament, the evidence available to the ministry had been limited. Accepting the claim immediately would have meant announcing the beginning of another war based largely on the testimony of a single witness. Fudge chose caution instead. He believed that protecting the wizarding community from fear required careful confirmation before making such an announcement. The minister worried that declaring Voldemort's return too quickly might cause panic across magical Britain. Yet history often shows how difficult it can be to recognize danger while it is still emerging. Voldemort's return did not happen suddenly in a way that everyone could immediately observe. It unfolded gradually, hidden behind secrecy and uncertainty. By the time the Dark Lord appeared openly within the ministry atrium, the moment for quiet caution had already passed. From that point forward, the wizarding world understood that Voldemort had returned and that a new conflict was beginning. The government needed leadership capable of organizing resistance against the Dark Lord and his followers. Fudge's removal from office reflected the belief that new leadership would help guide the ministry through that difficult period. Outside the political center of the wizarding world, however, life continued moving forward for many witches and wizards who remembered Fudge's years as minister. Shop owners in Diagon Alley, ministry employees, and ordinary magical families had lived through a long period of relative peace during his administration. For them, Fudge's leadership represented an era when the wizarding world had appeared stable and predictable. The rise of Voldemort once again changed that reality. As the Second Wizarding War developed under the leadership of Rufus Scrimgeour, the Ministry faced increasing pressure from Voldemort's expanding network of followers. Death Eater attacks, disappearances, and acts of intimidation began spreading through magical communities. These events reminded witches and wizards across Britain that the threat Harry Potter had warned about was very real. Cornelius Fudge remained largely absent from these later developments. Without the authority of the minister's office, his role within the wizarding world became quieter and less visible. The responsibility for guiding the government through the conflict now rested entirely with the new administration. Yet the story of Fudge's career continued to influence how people understood the early stages of Voldemort's return. Some saw his actions as an example of how fear of public panic can delay recognition of real danger. Others believed his decisions reflected the difficulty of leading a community that had already experienced the devastation of war. Either way, the period of denial before Voldemort's return was officially acknowledged became one of the most debated chapters in the history of the Ministry of Magic. Cornelius Fudge had spent years trying to protect the wizarding world from the possibility of another Dark Age. In the end, that Dark Age arrived anyway. After stepping away from the office of Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge became a far quieter figure within the wizarding world. For many years, he had been a constant presence in government affairs, appearing regularly in ministry announcements and public discussions about magical law and security. Now, the direction of those conversations belonged to the new leadership guiding the ministry through a time of open conflict. Rufus Scrimgeour's administration approached the growing crisis with urgency. Auras were deployed more widely, investigations into dark activity increased, and the government began treating Voldemort's network of followers as an organized threat rather than a distant possibility. The wizarding world entered a period defined by heightened vigilance. During this time, Cornelius Fudge remained largely outside the center of political decision-making. Although he no longer directed the ministry's policies, his earlier actions continued influencing how many witches and wizards understood the beginning of the Second Wizarding War. The months when the government had denied Voldemort's return became a topic of quiet discussion across magical Britain. Some citizens spoke about those months with frustration. They believed the ministry should have acted sooner once Harry Potter reported what had happened in the graveyard during the Triwizard Tournament. From their perspective, the government's hesitation had given Voldemort valuable time to reorganize his followers. Others viewed the situation with greater sympathy. They remembered that the wizarding world had already experienced years of fear during the First War against the Dark Lord. For many families, the idea that Voldemort might return was difficult to accept without clear evidence. The ministry's reluctance to announce such a terrifying possibility reflected the same hope that many ordinary witches and wizards felt. Cornelius Fudge had governed during a period when that hope still seemed possible. For more than a decade after Voldemort's first defeat, magical Britain had rebuilt its sense of normal life. Children attended Hogwarts without expecting to encounter dark magic beyond their lessons. Businesses operated in Diagon Alley and Hogsmeade without constant fear of attack. The wizarding community believed that the worst years of conflict were part of history. Fudge's political instincts had developed within that environment. His leadership style focused on maintaining the stability that had returned to the wizarding world. He trusted the ministry's systems of law enforcement and believed that careful administration could preserve the calm that society had achieved. When Harry Potter first announced that Voldemort had returned, accepting that claim immediately would have meant acknowledging that the entire structure of that stability might collapse again. Instead, Fudge attempted to protect the sense of security that the wizarding community had enjoyed for so long. In hindsight, historians of magical government often describe this moment as a turning point in Fudge's career. The choice to deny Voldemort's return shaped how his time as minister would be remembered. It was a decision made under pressure, influenced by fear of public panic and by the uncertainty surrounding the evidence available at the time. Once the Dark Lord appeared openly inside the Ministry building, however, that uncertainty disappeared. The wizarding world moved quickly into a new period of confrontation, and the government required leadership prepared to manage the challenges of war. Rufus Scrimgeour's appointment reflected that need. From that point forward, Cornelius Fudge's role became part of the historical record rather than the present struggle. Witches and wizards who studied the events leading up to the Second Wizarding War often examined his decisions carefully. They asked how political leadership responds when a community faces the possibility of returning danger. They considered how fear, uncertainty, and responsibility can shape the choices made by those in positions of authority. The story of Cornelius Fudge, therefore, became more than the biography of a single minister. It became an example of how governments sometimes react when confronted with threats that challenge their understanding of the world around them. The desire to preserve calm can conflict with the need to recognize danger before it becomes impossible to ignore. While the Second Wizarding War unfolded under new leadership, the memory of those earlier decisions remained part of the wizarding world's understanding of the conflict. Cornelius Fudge had once stood at the center of magical Britain's government during the years when Voldemort quietly rebuilt his power. By the time the Dark Lord returned openly, that chapter of leadership had already come to its end. As the Second Wizarding War continued under the leadership of Rufus Scrimgeour, the earlier years of Cornelius Fudge's administration gradually moved from current politics into historical reflection. The wizarding world had entered a time of open conflict, and most attention now focused on the growing threat posed by Voldemort and his followers. Yet the decisions made during the months after the Triwizard Tournament remained an important part of understanding how the conflict had developed. For many witches and wizards, those months represented a moment when the wizarding government struggled to interpret events that did not yet appear clearly connected. Voldemort had returned quietly, without the immediate wave of violence that had marked the beginning of his first rise to power. Instead, his early movements took place in secrecy. Because of this, the evidence available to the Ministry of Magic during that period had been incomplete. Harry Potter's account of the graveyard described the Dark Lord's return with certainty, but the Ministry did not immediately possess proof that could be confirmed independently. Aura's investigating suspicious activity found little that clearly connected those events to Voldemort himself. The absence of visible attacks made the situation difficult for officials attempting to determine the truth. Cornelius Fudge approached this uncertainty with caution. Throughout his career within the Ministry, he had developed a strong belief that the government's responsibility was to maintain stability. Announcing the return of the most feared dark wizard in history without clear evidence could cause panic across magical Britain. Families might abandon their homes, businesses might close, and trust in the Ministry could collapse. From Fudge's perspective, preventing that outcome seemed essential. He therefore relied on the systems that had guided the wizarding government for many years. Investigations continued quietly, reports were reviewed carefully, and the Daily Prophet reflected the Ministry's cautious position until undeniable proof appeared. The government avoided declaring that Voldemort had returned. In hindsight, historians of the wizarding world often examined this decision with mixed judgment. Some scholars argued that the Ministry's hesitation allowed Voldemort to strengthen his position during the crucial early months of his return. By the time the Dark Lord revealed himself openly within the Ministry atrium, his followers had already begun reorganizing their network. Others suggested that the situation faced by Cornelius Fudge was more complicated than it might appear later. Governments are often forced to make decisions based on incomplete information. The responsibility of protecting an entire community requires balancing caution with the need to recognize emerging threats. The wizarding world of that time had also been shaped by the memory of the First War against Voldemort. That earlier conflict had brought years of fear and uncertainty to magical Britain. Many witches and wizards hoped that such a period would never return. This hope influenced the way people interpreted the first reports of Voldemort's possible return. Fudge's leadership reflected this broader desire for reassurance. He believed that maintaining calm within the wizarding world would protect the community while investigators worked to confirm the truth. The minister expected that if Voldemort had truly returned, clear evidence would eventually appear. When that evidence did appear inside the ministry itself, the situation changed immediately. The battle within the Department of Mysteries revealed that Voldemort and his followers were already active. Once the Dark Lord appeared in the atrium, the ministry could no longer deny the reality that Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore had warned about. The government then shifted its position quickly, acknowledging the return of the Dark Lord and preparing for the conflict ahead. Yet by that time, the political consequences of the earlier denial had already taken effect. Confidence in Cornelius Fudge's leadership had weakened, and the ministry required a new direction to guide its response to the war that was now beginning. This transition eventually brought Rufus Scrimgeour into the office of Minister for Magic. Under his leadership, the ministry focused on confronting Voldemort directly through expanded Auror operations and stronger security measures across magical Britain. The wizarding world entered a period defined by vigilance and preparation rather than cautious reassurance. As the war progressed, the early months of Voldemort's return became an important subject of reflection for those studying the conflict. Cornelius Fudge's decisions illustrated how political leadership can be shaped by the desire to protect stability during uncertain times. His administration had tried to preserve the peace that the wizarding world had enjoyed for more than a decade. In the end, however, the forces moving through the shadows of magical society could not be managed through reassurance alone. By the time the truth became undeniable, the wizarding world had already begun its journey into another war. In the years that followed the beginning of the Second Wizarding War, the role Cornelius Fudge had played during its earliest stage gradually became part of the broader history of the conflict. The wizarding world faced many challenges as Voldemort's influence spread across magical Britain. Aurors fought to protect communities. Members of the Order of the Phoenix worked quietly to resist the Dark Lord's followers, and the Ministry of Magic struggled to maintain order during a time of growing fear. Amid these developments, the months before the ministry officially acknowledged Voldemort's return remained an important subject of reflection. For many witches and wizards, those months illustrated how difficult it can be to recognize danger while it is still forming. Voldemort's return had not begun with large battles or open attacks. Instead, it unfolded quietly through secret gatherings, hidden plans, and the gradual reappearance of followers who had once served the Dark Lord. Because these events took place largely out of public view, the wizarding government faced a problem that had few clear solutions. Announcing the return of Voldemort without undeniable proof could create widespread panic. Ignoring the possibility entirely risked allowing the threat to grow unnoticed. Cornelius Fudge chose the path that he believed would best preserve stability. Throughout his time as minister, he had focused on maintaining confidence in the Ministry of Magic. After the devastation of the First Wizarding War, he believed the government's responsibility was to protect the wizarding community from fear and disorder. His decisions were shaped by that belief. When Harry Potter reported that Voldemort had returned after the Triwizard Tournament, Fudge struggled to accept the claim immediately. The evidence available to the ministry seemed uncertain, and the idea that the Dark Lord had risen again threatened to undo years of recovery across magical Britain. The minister therefore placed his trust in investigation and confirmation. He relied on the ministry's systems of law enforcement to examine the reports surrounding the graveyard incident. At the same time, he worked to reassure the wizarding public that there was no reason to assume the beginning of another war. In doing so, Fudge believed he was protecting the community from unnecessary fear. Yet the reality of Voldemort's return did not wait for certainty. While the ministry debated how to interpret the available evidence, the Dark Lord quietly rebuilt his network of followers. Death Eaters began returning to his side, and the structures that had once supported his power slowly reappeared. By the time Voldemort revealed himself openly during the battle at the Department of Mysteries, the period of uncertainty had already ended. From that moment forward, the wizarding world entered a new era of confrontation. For historians studying the conflict later, Cornelius Fudge's leadership became an important example of how governments sometimes respond when faced with threats that challenge their understanding of reality. His decisions were shaped by a sincere desire to protect stability, yet those same decisions delayed recognition of the danger that was already emerging. Many scholars noted that the minister's situation reflected a broader challenge faced by leaders throughout history. When evidence of a threat appears gradually and remains difficult to confirm, the responsibility of deciding how to respond can become extremely complicated. Acting too quickly may create unnecessary fear. Acting too slowly may allow the threat to grow stronger. Cornelius Fudge stood at the center of that dilemma during the months following the Triwizard Tournament. In the end, his time as Minister for Magic became defined by the moment when the truth about Voldemort's return could no longer be denied. The battle inside the Ministry forced the wizarding government to confront the reality that Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore had warned about. After stepping down from office, Fudge's role in public life grew quieter. The responsibility for guiding the Ministry through the war passed to new leadership, while the former minister became part of the historical narrative surrounding the conflict. Yet, his story continued to offer insight into the early stages of the Second Wizarding War. It showed how the desire to preserve peace can influence the decisions of those in power, even when darker forces are already beginning to rise. And it reminded the wizarding world that the return of Voldemort had not begun with the roar of battle, but with a period of uncertainty that few leaders fully understood at the time. When historians later examined the events surrounding the return of Voldemort, the career of Cornelius Fudge often appeared as a reflection of the wizarding world during a moment of difficult transition. His years as Minister for Magic had taken place during a period when magical Britain believed it had finally recovered from the fear that once defined the Dark Lord's rise to power. For more than a decade, that belief had shaped the decisions made within the Ministry. The wizarding government focused on maintaining order, regulating magical society, and ensuring that the quiet stability following Voldemort's first defeat continued. Families rebuilt their lives, businesses in Diagon Alley and Hogsmeade flourished again, and Hogwarts returned to its role as a place where young witches and wizards could study magic without expecting to face the dangers of war. Cornelius Fudge governed during those years of recovery. His leadership style reflected the priorities of that time. He valued cooperation within the Ministry, trusted established systems of administration, and believed strongly in the importance of preserving calm across the wizarding community. Stability was the principle that guided his decisions. When the first reports of Voldemort's possible return reached the Ministry after the Triwizard Tournament, they challenged the entire foundation of that stability. Accepting Harry Potter's warning immediately would have meant announcing that the wizarding world had entered another dangerous era. It would have forced the government to confront the possibility that the peace of the previous years had already begun to unravel. Instead, Fudge attempted to protect the sense of security that many witches and wizards had come to rely upon. His government sought confirmation, examined evidence, and reassured the public that there was no reason to assume the Dark Lord had returned. These actions were shaped by a belief that the Ministry's responsibility was not only to enforce laws, but also to guard the confidence of the community it served. Yet history often moves in ways that challenge even the most careful intentions. While the Ministry hesitated to declare the return of Voldemort without undeniable proof, the Dark Lord was quietly rebuilding his power. His followers gathered once more, hidden alliances formed, and the shadow of a new conflict slowly stretched across the wizarding world. By the time the truth revealed itself inside the Ministry atrium, the period of uncertainty had already ended. From that moment forward, the wizarding world understood that Voldemort had returned and that the struggle against him would begin again. The leadership of the ministry changed, preparations for conflict expanded, and witches and wizards across magical Britain entered a new chapter in their history. Cornelius Fudge's time as minister therefore became closely connected to the moment when the wizarding world struggled to recognize the danger before it. Some later observers criticized the decisions made during those months. Others viewed them as the result of a leader attempting to preserve stability in a time when the truth remained uncertain. What remained clear was that Fudge had governed during one of the most complex transitions in modern wizarding history. He had led the ministry during the years when magical Britain believed the worst threats of the past had faded, and he had stood at the center of the government when those threats quietly began returning. The story of Cornelius Fudge does not end with dramatic battles or powerful spells. Instead, it ends with a lesson about leadership during uncertain times. Sometimes the most difficult challenges faced by those in power are not the conflicts that everyone can see, but the moments when danger begins quietly and the truth remains difficult to accept. During those moments, the choices made by leaders can shape how an entire world responds to the future that is slowly unfolding. The story of Cornelius Fudge unfolds quietly within the larger history of the wizarding world. He was never a dark wizard, never a legendary hero, and never someone remembered for great magical battles. Instead, he was a leader who tried to guide a fragile society during a time when the past still lingered and the future remained uncertain. For many years, he believed that preserving stability was the ministry's most important responsibility. After the chaos of the First Wizarding War, that belief seemed reasonable. Peace had returned, families rebuilt their lives, and the wizarding community hoped that the darkest chapters of its history had already passed. Yet the return of Voldemort revealed how quickly certainty can disappear. Fudge's story reminds us that leadership is often tested not when danger is obvious, but when it first appears quietly, wrapped in uncertainty and doubt. The choices made in those early moments can shape everything that follows. And as the wizarding world moved forward into another era of conflict, the years of Cornelius Fudge remained a reminder that even the calmest chapters of history can contain the first signs of storms yet to come.